Section 23 of Rachel Ray. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicholas Clifford. Rachel Ray by Anthony Trollope. Section 23, Mrs. Ray's Penitence. Another fortnight went by, and still nothing further was heard at Bragg's End from Luke Rowan. Much was heard of him in Baselhurst. It was soon known by everybody that he had bought the cottages, and there was a widely spread and well-credited rumour that he was going to commence the necessary buildings for a new brew-house at once. Nor were these tidings received by Baselhurst with all that horror, with that loud clamour of indignation, which Tappit conceived to be due to them. Why should not Bungall's nephew carry on a brewery of his own? Especially why should he not, if he were resolved to brew good beer? Very censorious remarks about the Tappit beer were to be heard in all bar-rooms, and were re-echoed with vehemence in the kitchens of the Baselhurst aristocracy. "It ain't beer," said Dr. Harford's cook, who had come from the Midland counties and knew what good beer was. "It's a nasty muddle of stuff, not fit for any Christian who has to earn her victuals over a kitchen fire." It came to pass speedily that Luke Rowan was expected to build a new brewery, and that the event of the first brick was looked for with anxious expectation, and that false report which had spread itself through Baselhurst respecting him and his debts had taken itself off. It had been banished by a contrary report, and there now existed in Baselhurst a very general belief that Rowan was a man of means, of very considerable means, a man of substantial capital, whom to have settled in the town would be very beneficial to the community. That false statement as to the bill at Griggs's had been sifted, and the truth made known, and somewhat to the disgrace of the Tappit faction. The only article supplied by Griggs to Rowan's order had been the champagne consumed at Tappit's supper, and for this Rowan had paid ready money within a week of the transaction. It was Mrs. Cornbury who discovered all this, and who employed means for making the truth known in Baselhurst. This truth also became known at last to Mrs. Ray, but of what avail was it then? She had desired her daughter to treat the young man as a wolf, and as a wolf he had been hounded off for her little sheep-cot. She heard now that he was expected back at Baselhurst, that he was a wealthy man, that he was thought well of in the town, that he was going to do great things. With what better possible husband could any young woman have been blessed? And yet she had turned him away from her cottage as though he had been a wolf. It was from Mrs. Sturt that Mrs. Ray first learned the truth. Mr. Sturt was a tenant on the Cornbury estate, and Mrs. Sturt was of course well known to Mrs. Cornbury. That lady, when she had sifted to the bottom the story of Griggs's bill, and had assured herself that Rowan was by no means minded to surrender his interest in Baselhurst, determined that the truth should be made known to Mrs. Ray. But she was not willing to call on Mrs. Ray herself, nor did she wish to present herself before Rachel at the cottage unless she could bring with her some more substantial comfort than could be afforded by simple evidence as to Rowan's good character. She therefore took herself to Mrs. Sturt and discussed the matter with her. "I suppose she does care about him," said Mrs. Cornbury, sitting in Mrs. Sturt's little parlour that opened out upon the kitchen garden. Mrs. Sturt was also seated, leaning on the corner of the table, with the sleeves of her gown tucked up, ready for work when the squire's lady should be gone, but very willing to postpone her work as long as the squire's lady would stay and gossip with her. "Oh, that she do, Mrs. Butler, in her heart of hearts. If I know anything of true love, she do love that young man." "And did he offer to her? There can be no doubt about that, I suppose." "Not a doubt on earth, Mrs. Butler. She never told me so outright, nor yet didn't her mother, but if he didn't, I'll give my head for a cream cheese. Laws love you, Mrs. Butler, I know what's what well enough. I know when a girl's wild and flighty and thinks of things as she oughtn't, and I know when she's proper behaved and gives a young man encouragement only when it becomes her." "Of course you do, Mrs. Sturt." "It isn't for me, Mrs. Butler, to say anything against your papa. Nobody can have more respect for their clergyman than Sturt has and I. But before it was all settled like, Sturt never had a word with Mr. Comfort about tithes. But, Mrs. Butler, I think your papa was wrong here. As far as I can learn, it was he that told Mrs. Ray that this young man wasn't all that he should be." "Papa meant it for the best. There were strange things said about him, you know." "I never believes one word of what I hears, and never will. People are such liars, bean't they, Mrs. Butler? And I didn't believe a word agin him. He's as fine a young man as you'd wish to see in 100 years, and of course that goes a long way with a young woman. Well, Mrs. Butler, I'll tell Mrs. Ray what you say, but I'm afeard it's too late, I'm afeard it is. He's of a stubborn sort, I think. He's one of them that says, 'If you will not when you may, when you will you shall have nay.'" Mrs. Cornbury still entertained the hope that the stubbornness of the stubborn man might be overcome, but as to that she said nothing to Mrs. Sturt. Mrs. Sturt, with what friendly tact she possessed, made her communication to Mrs. Ray, but it may be doubted whether more harm than good was not thus done. "And he didn't owe a shilling, then?" asked Mrs. Ray. "Not a shilling," said Mrs. Sturt. "And he is going to come back to Baselhurst about this brewery business?" "There's not a doubt in life about that," answered Mrs. Sturt. If these tidings could have come in time, they would have been very salutary. But what was Mrs. Ray to do with them now? She felt that she could not honestly withhold them from Rachel, and yet she knew not how to tell them without adding to Rachel's misery. It was very improbable that Rachel should hear anything about Rowan from other lips than her own. It was clear that Mrs. Sturt did not intend to speak to her, and also clear that Mrs. Sturt expected that Mrs. Ray would do so. Rachel's demeanour at this time was cause of great sorrow to Mrs. Ray. She never smiled, she sought no amusement, she read no books, she spoke but little, and when she did speak her words were hard and cold, and confined almost entirely to household affairs. Her mother knew that she was not ill, because she ate and drank and worked. Even Dorothea must have been satisfied with the amount of needlework which she produced in these days. But though not ill, she was thin and pale, and unlike herself. But perhaps of all the signs which her mother watched so carefully, the signs which tormented her most were those ever-present lines on her daughter's forehead, lines which Mrs. Ray had now learned to read correctly, and which indicated some settled inward purpose, and an inward resolve that that purpose should become the subject of no outward discussion. Rachel had formerly been everything to her mother, her friend, her minister, her guide, her great comfort, the subject on which could be lavished all the soft tenderness of her nature, the loving object to whom could be addressed all the little innocent petulances of her life. But now Mrs. Ray did not dare to be either tender with Rachel or petulant. She hardly dared to speak to her on subjects that were not indifferent. On this matter of Luke Rowan she did not dare to speak to her. Rachel never upbraided her with words, had never spoken one word of reproach. But every moment of their passing life was an unspoken reproach, so severe and heavy that the poor mother hardly knew how to bear the burden of her fault. As Mrs. Ray became more afraid of her younger daughter, she became less afraid of the elder. This was occasioned, partly no doubt, by the absence of Mrs. Prime from the cottage. When there, she only came as a visitor, and no visitor to a house can hold such dominion there as may be held by a domestic tyrant, present at all meals, and claiming an ascendancy in all conversations. But it arose in part also from the overwhelming solicitude which filled Mrs. Ray's heart from morning to night as she watched poor Rachel in her misery. Her bowels yearned towards her child, and she longed to give her relief with an excessive longing. Had the man been a very wolf indeed, such were her feelings at present, I think that she would have welcomed him to the cottage. In ordering his repulse she had done a deed of which she had by no means anticipated the consequences, and now she repented in the sackcloth and ashes of a sorrow-stricken spirit. Ah me! What could she do to relieve the oppressed one? So thoroughly did this desire override others in her breast, that she would snub Mrs. Prime without dreading or even thinking of the consequences. Her only hopes and her only fears at the present moment had reference to Rachel. Had Rachel proposed to her that they should both start off to London and there search for Luke Rowan, I doubt whether she would have had the heart to decline the journey. In these days Mrs. Prime came to the cottage regularly, twice a week, on Wednesdays and Saturdays. On Wednesday she came after tea, and on Saturday she drank tea with her mother. On these occasions much was, of course, said as to the prospect of her marriage with Mr. Prong. Nothing was as yet settled, and Rachel had concluded in her own mind that there would be no such wedding. As to Mrs. Ray's opinion, she, of course, thought there would be a wedding or there would not, in accordance with the last words spoken by Mrs. Prime to herself on the occasion of that special conversation. "She'll never give up her money," Rachel had said, "and he'll never marry her unless she does." Mrs. Prime at this period acknowledged to her mother that she was not happy. "I want," she said, "to do what's right, but it's not always easy to find out what is right." "That's very true," said Mrs. Ray, thinking that there were difficulties in the affairs of other people quite as embarrassing as those of which Mrs. Prime complained. "He says," continued the younger widow, "that he wants nothing for himself, but that it is not fitting that a married woman should have a separate income." "I think he's right there," said Mrs. Ray. "I quite believe what he says about himself," said Mrs. Prime. "It is not that he wants my money for the money's sake, but that he chooses to dictate to me how I shall use it." "So he ought to, if he's to be your husband," said Mrs. Ray. These conversations usually took place in Rachel's absence. When Mrs. Prime came, Rachel would remain long enough to say a word to her, and on the Saturdays would pour out the tea for her, and would hand to her the bread and butter with the courtesy due to a visitor, but after that she would take herself to her own bedroom, and only come down when Mrs. Prime had prepared herself for going. At last, on one of these evenings, there came a proposition from Mrs. Prime that she should return to the cottage, and live again with her mother and sister. She had not said that she absolutely rejected Mr. Prong, but she spoke of her return as though it had become expedient, because the cause of her going away had been removed. Very little had been said between her and her mother about Rachel's love affair, nor was Mrs. Prime inclined to say much about it now, but so much as that she did say. "No doubt it's all over now about that young man, and therefore, if you like it, I don't see why I shouldn't come back." "I don't know at all about its being all over," said Mrs. Ray in a hurried, quick tone, and as she spoke she blushed with emotion. "But I suppose it is, mother. From all that I can hear, he isn't thinking of her, and I don't suppose he ever did much." "I don't know what he's thinking about, Dorothea, and I ain't sure that there's any good talking about it. Besides, if you're going to have Mr. Prong at last—" "If I did, mother, it needn't prevent my coming here for a month or two first. It wouldn't be quite yet, certainly, if at all. And I thought that perhaps, if I am going to settle myself in that way, you'd be glad that we should be all together again for a little while." "So I should, Dorothea, of course. I have never wanted to be divided from my children. Your going away was your own doing, not mine. I'm sure it made me so wretched I didn't know what to do at the time. Only other things have come since that have pretty nearly put all that out of my mind." But you can't think I was wrong to go when I felt it to be right." "I don't know how that may be," said Mrs. Ray. "If you thought it right to go, I suppose you were right to go. But perhaps you shouldn't have had such thoughts." "Well, mother, we won't go back to that." "No, we won't, if you please." This, at any rate, is certain, that Rachel, in departing from our usual ways of life, has brought great unhappiness upon herself. I am afraid she is thinking of this young man now more than she ought to do. "Of course she is thinking of him. Why should she not think of him?" "Why, mother, surely it cannot be good that any girl should think of a man who thinks nothing of her." Then Mrs. Ray spoke out, as perhaps she had never spoken before. "What right have you to say that he thinks nothing of her? Who can tell? He did think of her, as honestly as any man ever thought of the woman he wished to mate with. He came to her fairly and asked her to be his wife. What can any man do more by a girl than that? And she didn't say a word to encourage him till those she had a right to look to had encouraged him too. So she didn't. And I don't believe any woman ever had a child that behaved better or truer or more maidenly than she has done. And I was a fool, and worse than a fool, when I allowed any one to have an evil thought of her for a moment." "Do you mean me, mother?" "I don't mean anybody except myself, so I don't." Mrs. Ray, as she spoke, was weeping bitterly, and rubbing the tears from her red eyes with her apron. "I've behaved like a fool to her, worse than a fool, and I've broken her heart. Not think of him! How's a girl not to think of a man day and night when she loves him better than herself? Think of him! She'll think of him till she's in her grave. She'll think of him till she's past all other thinking. I hate such cruelty, and I hate myself for having been cruel. I shall never forgive myself the longest day I have to live." "You only did your duty, mother." "No, I didn't do my duty at all. It can't be a mother's duty to break her child's heart, and to be set against her by what anybody else can say. She was ever and always the best child that ever lived, and she came away from him and strove to banish him from her thoughts, and wouldn't own to herself that she cared for him the least in the world, till he'd come here and spoken out straight, like a man as he is. I tell you what, Dorothea, I'd go to London on my knees to him if I could bring him back to her. I would, and if he comes here, I will go to him." "Oh, mother!" "I know he loves her. He's not one of your inconstant ones that take up with the girl for a week or so and then forgets her. But she has offended him, and he's stubborn. She has offended him at my bidding, and it's my doing, and I'd humble myself in the dust to bring him back to her. So I would. Never tell me of her not thinking of him. I tell you, Dorothea, she'll think of him always, not because she has loved him, but because she has been brought to confess her love." Mrs. Ray was so strong in her mingled passion and grief that Mrs. Prime made no attempt to rebuke her. The daughter was indeed quelled by her mother's vehemence, and felt that for the present the subject of Rachel's love and Rachel's lover was not a fitting one for the exercise of her own talents as a preacher. The tragedy had progressed beyond the reach of her preaching. Mrs. Ray protested that Rachel had been right throughout, and that she herself had been wrong only when she had opposed Rachel's wishes. Such a view of the matter was altogether at variance with that entertained by Mrs. Prime, who was still of opinion that young people shouldn't be allowed to please themselves, and who feared the approach of any lover who came with lute in hand, and with light, soft, loving, worldly words. Men and women, according to her theory, were right to marry and have children, but she thought that such marriages should be contracted not only in a solemn spirit, but with a certain dinginess of solemnity, with a painstaking absence of mirth that would divest love of its worldly alloy. Rachel had gone about her business in a different spirit, and it may almost be said that Mrs. Prime rejoiced that she had failed. She did not believe in broken hearts. She did believe in the efficacy of chastisement, and she thought that on the whole the present state of affairs would be beneficial to her sister. Had she been possessed of sufficient power, she would now, on this occasion, have preached her sermon again as she had preached it before, but her mother's passion had overcome her, and she was unable to express her convictions. "I hope that she will be better soon," she said. "I hope she will," said Mrs. Ray. At this moment Rachel came down from her own room and joined them in the parlour. She came in with that same look of sad composure on her face, as though she were determined to speak nothing of her thoughts to any one, and sat herself down near to her sister. In doing so, however, she caught a glimpse of her mother's face, and saw that she had been crying, saw indeed that she was still crying at that moment. "Mamma," she said, "what is the matter? Has anything happened?" "No, dear, nothing has happened." "But you would not cry for nothing. What is it, Dolly?" "We have been talking," said Dorothea. "Things in this world are not so pleasant in themselves that they can always be spoken of without tears, either outward tears or inward. People are too apt to think that there is no true significance in their words when they say that this world is a vale of tears." "All the same, I don't like to see mamma crying like that." "Don't mind it, Rachel," said Mrs. Ray. "If you will not regard me, I shall be better soon." "I was saying that I thought I would come back to the cottage," said Mrs. Prime. "That is, if mother likes it." "But that did not make mamma cry." "There were other things arose out of my saying so." Then Rachel asked no further questions, but sat silent, waiting till her sister should go. "Of course we shall be very glad to have you back again if it suits you," said Mrs. Ray. "I don't think it at all nice that a family should be divided, that is, as long as they are the same family." Having received so much encouragement with reference to her proposed return, Mrs. Prime took her departure and walked back to Baselhurst. For some minutes after they had been so left, neither Mrs. Ray nor Rachel spoke. The mother sat rocking herself in her chair, and the daughter remained motionless in the seat which she had taken when she first came into the room. Their faces were not turned to each other, but Rachel was so placed that she could watch her mother without being observed. Every now and again Mrs. Ray would put her hand up to her eyes to squeeze away the tears, and a low gurgling sound would come from her, as though she was striving without success to repress her sobs. She had thought that she would speak to Rachel when Mrs. Prime was gone, that she would confess her error in having sent Rowan away, and implore her child to pardon her and to love her once again. It was not, however, that she doubted Rachel's love, that she feared that Rachel was casting her out from her heart, or that she was learning to hate her. She knew well enough that her child still loved her. It was this, that her life had become barren to her, cold, and altogether tasteless, without those thousand little signs of ever-present affection to which she had been accustomed. If it was to be always thus between them, what would the world be to her for the remainder of her days? She could have borne to part with Rachel, had Rachel married, as in parting with her she would have looked forward to some future return of her girl's caresses, and in such case she would at least have felt that her loss had come from no cessation of the sweet loving nature of their mutual connection. She would have wept as she gave Rachel over to her husband, but her tears would have been sweet as well as bitter. But there was nothing of sweetness in her tears as she shed them now, nothing of satisfaction in her sorrow. If she could get Rachel to talk with her freely on the matter, if she could find an opportunity for confessing herself to have been wrong, might it not be that the soft caresses would be restored to her, caresses that would be soft though moistened with salt tears? But she feared to speak to her child. She knew that Rachel's face was still hard and stern, and that her voice was not the voice of other days. She knew that her daughter brooded over the injury that had been done to her, though she knew also that no accusation was made, even in the girl's own bosom, against herself. She thoroughly understood the state of Rachel's mind, but she was unable to find the words that might serve to soften it. "I suppose we may as well go to bed," she said at last, giving the matter up, at any rate for that evening. "Mamma, why were you crying when I came into the room?" said Rachel. "Was I crying, my dear?" "You are crying still, mamma. Is it I that make you unhappy?" Mrs. Ray was anxious to declare that the reverse of that was true, that it was she who had made the other unhappy, but even now she could not find the words in which to say this. "No," she said, "it isn't you. It isn't anybody. I believe it's true what Mr. Comfort has told us so often when he's preaching. It's all vanity and vexation. There isn't anything to make anybody happy. I suppose I cry because I'm foolisher than other people. I don't know that anybody is happy. I'm sure Dorothea is not, and I'm sure you ain't." "I do not want you to be unhappy about me, mamma." "Of course you don't. I know that. But how can I help it when I see how things have gone? I tried to do for the best, and I have broken my child's heart," Mrs. Ray intended to say, but she failed altogether before she got as far as that, and bursting out into a flood of tears, hid her face in her apron. Rachel still kept her seat, and her face was still hard and unmoved. Her mother did not see it. She did not dare to look upon it, but she knew that it was so. She knew her daughter would have been with her, close to her, embracing her, throwing her arms around her, had that face relented. But Rachel still kept her chair, and Mrs. Ray sobbed aloud. "I wish I could be a comfort to you, mamma," Rachel said after another pause, "but I do not know how. I suppose in time we shall get over this, and things will be as they used to be." "They'll never be to me as they used to be before he came to Baselhurst," said Mrs. Ray through her tears. "At any rate that is not his fault," said Rachel almost angrily. "Whoever may have done wrong, no one has a right to say that he has done wrong." "I'm sure I never said so. It is I that have done wrong," exclaimed Mrs. Ray. "I know it all now, and I wish I'd never asked anybody but just my own heart. I didn't mean to say anything against him, and I don't think it. I'm sure I liked him, as I never liked any young man the first time of seeing him, that night he came out here to tea, and I know that what they said against him was all false. So I do." "What was all false, mamma?" "About his going away in debt and being a ne'er-do-well, and about his going away from Baselhurst and not coming back any more. Everybody has a good word for him now." "Have they, mamma?" said Rachel. And Mrs. Ray learned in a moment, from the tone of her daughter's voice, that a change had come over her feeling. She asked her little question with something of the softness of her old manner, with something of the longing, loving wishfulness which used to make so many of her questions sweet to her mother's ears. "Have they, mamma?" "Yes, they have, and I believe it was those wicked people at the brewery who spread the reports about him. As for owing anybody money, I believe he's got plenty. Of course he has, or how could he have bought our cottages and paid for them all in a minute? And I believe he'll come back and live at Baselhurst, so I do, only—" "Only what, mamma?" "If he's not to come back to you, I'd rather that he never showed his face here again." "He won't come to me, mamma. Had he meant it, he would have sent me a message." "Perhaps he meant that he wouldn't send the message till he came himself," said Mrs. Ray. But she made the suggestion in a voice so full of conscious doubt that Rachel knew she did not believe in it herself. "I don't think he means that, mamma. If he did, why should he keep me in doubt? He is very true and very honest, but I think he is very hard. When I wrote to him in that way after accepting the love he had offered me, he was angered and felt that I was false to him. He is very honest, but I think he must be very hard." I can't think that if he loved you he would be so hard as that." "Men are different from women, I suppose. I feel about him that whatever he might do, I should forgive it. But then I feel also that he would never do anything for me to forgive." "I'll never forgive him, never, if he doesn't come back again." "Don't say that, mamma. You've no right even to be angry with him, because it was we who told him that there was to be no engagement, after I had promised him." "I didn't think he'd take you up so at the first word," said Mrs. Ray. And then again there was silence for a few minutes. "Mamma," said Rachel. "Well, Rachel?" Mrs. Ray was still rocking in her chair, and had hardly yet repressed that faint gurgling sound of half-controlled sobs. "I am so glad to hear you say that you respect him, and don't believe of him what people have said." "I don't believe a word bad of him, except that he oughtn't to take huff in that way at one word that a girl says to him. He ought to have known that you couldn't write just what letter you liked, as he could." "We won't say anything more about that. But as long as you don't think him bad—" "I don't think him bad. I don't think him bad at all. I think him very good. I'd give all I have in the world to bring him back again. So I would." "Dear mamma." And now Rachel moved away from her chair and came up to her mother. "And I know it's been all my fault. Oh, my child, I am so unhappy. I don't get half an hour's sleep at night thinking of what I have done. I that would have given the very blood out of my veins to make you happy." "No, mamma, it wasn't you." "Yes, it was. I'd no business going away to other people after I had told him he might come here. You who had always been so good, too." "You mustn't say again that you wish he hadn't come here." "Oh, but I do wish it, because then he would have been nothing to you. I do wish he hadn't ever come, but now I'd do anything to bring him back again. I believe I'll go to him and tell him that it was my doing." "No, mamma, you won't do that." "Why should I not? I don't care what people say. Isn't your happiness everything to me?" "But I shouldn't take him if he came in that way. What, beg him to come and have compassion on me, as if I couldn't live without him? No, mother, that wouldn't do. I do love him. I do love him. I sometimes think I cannot live without his love. I sometimes feel as though stories about broken hearts might be true. But I wouldn't have him in that way. How could he love me afterwards, when I was his wife? But, mamma, we'll be friends again, shall we not? I've been so unhappy that you should have thought ill of him." That night the mother and daughter shared the same bed together, and Mrs. Ray was able to sleep. She would not confess to herself that her sorrow had been lightened, because nothing had been said or done to lessen that of her daughter. But on the morrow Rachel came and hovered round her again, and the bitterness of Mrs. Ray's grief was removed. End of section 23. Section 24 of Rachel Ray. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicholas Clifford. Rachel Ray by Anthony Trollope. Section 24. The Election at Baselhurst. Towards the end of September, the day of the election arrived, and with it arrived Luke Rowan at Baselhurst. The vacancy had been occasioned by the acceptance of the then sitting member of that situation under the Crown which is called the stewardship of the manor of Helpholme. In other words, an old gentleman who had done his life's work retired and made room for someone more young and active. The old member had kept his seat till the end of the session, just leaving time for the moving for a new writ, and now the election was about to be held almost at the earliest day possible. It had been thought that a little reflection would induce the Baselhurst people to reject the smiles of the Jew tailor from London, and therefore as little time for reflection was given to them as possible. The wealth, the liberal politics, the generosity, and the successes of Mr. Hart were dinned into their ears by a succession of speeches, and by an overpowering flight of enormous posters, and then the Jewish hero, the tailor himself, came among them and astonished their minds by the ease and volubility of his speeches. He did not pronounce his words with any of those soft, slushy, Judaic utterances by which they had been taught to believe he would disgrace himself. His nose was not hooky, with any especial hook, nor was it thicker at the bridge than was becoming. He was a dapper little man, with bright eyes, quick motion, ready tongue, and a very new hat. It seemed that he knew well how to canvass. He had a smile and a good word for all, enemies as well as friends. The task of abusing the Cornbury party he left to his committee and backers. He spent a great deal of money, throwing it away in every direction in which he could do so, without laying himself open to the watchful suspicion of the other side. He ate and drank like a Christian, and only laughed aloud when some true defender of the Protestant faith attempted to scare him away out of the streets by carrying a gammon of bacon up on high. Perhaps his strength as a popular candidate was best shown by his drinking a pint of Tappett's beer in the little parlour behind the bar at the Dragon. "He beats me there," said Butler Cornbury, when he heard of that feat. But the action was a wise one. The question as to Tappett's Brewery and Tappett's beer was running high at Baselhurst, and in no stronger way could Mr. Hart have bound to him the Tappett faction than by swallowing in public that pint of beer. "Let me have a small glass of brandy at once," said Mr. Hart to his servant, having retired to his room immediately after the performance of the feat. His constitution was good, and I may as well at once declare that before half an hour had passed over his head he was again himself and at work. The question of Tappett's beer and Tappett's Brewery was running high in Baslehurst, and had gotten itself involved in the mouths of the people of Baselhurst, not only with the loves and sorrows of poor Rachel Ray, but with the affairs of the election. We know how Tappett had been driven to declare himself a staunch supporter of the Jew. He had become very staunch beyond the promising of his own vote, staunch even to a final sitting on the Jews' committee and an active canvasser on the Jews' behalf. His wife, whose passions were less strong than his own and her prudence greater, had remonstrated with him on the matter. "You can vote against Cornbury if you please," she had said, "but do it quietly. Keep your toe in your pump and say nothing. Just as we stand at present about the business of Rowan's, it would almost be better that you shouldn't vote at all." But Tappett was an angry man, at this moment uncontrollable by the laws of prudence, and he went into these election matters heart and soul, to his wife's great grief. Butler Cornbury or Mrs. Butler Cornbury, it was all the same to him which, had openly taken up Rowan's part in the brewery controversy. A rumour had reached Tappett that the inmates of Cornbury Grange had loudly expressed a desire for good beer. Under such circumstances it was not possible for him not to rush to the fight. He did rush into the thick of it, and boasted among his friends that the Jew was safe. I think he was right at any rate as regarded his own peace of mind. Nothing gives a man such spirit for a fight as the act of fighting. During these election days he was almost regardless of Rowan. He was to second the nomination of the Jew, and so keen was he as to the speech that he would make, and as to the success of what he was doing against Mr. Cornbury, that he was able to talk down his wife and browbeat Honeyman in his own office. Honeyman was about to vote for Butler Cornbury, was employed in the Cornbury interest, and knew well on which side his bread was buttered. Sharpet and Longfight, were local attorneys for the Jew, and in this way Tappet was thrown into close intercourse with that eminent firm. "Of course we wouldn't interfere," said Sharpit confidently to the brewer. "We never do interfere with the clients of another firm. We never did such a thing yet, and don't mean to begin. We find people drop into us quick enough without that. But in a friendly way, Mr. Tappet, let me caution you not to let your fine business be injured by that young sharper." Mr. Tappet found this to be very kind, and very sensible too. He gave no authority to Sharpit on that occasion to act for him, but he thought of it, resolving that he would set his shoulders firmly to that wheel as soon as he had carried through this business of the election. But even in the matter of the election everything did not go well with Tappet. He had, appertaining to his establishment, a certain foreman of the name of Worts, a heavy, respectable, useful man, educated on the establishment by Bungall and bequeathed by Bungall to Tappet, a man by no means ambitious of good beer, but very ambitious of profits to the firm, a servant indeed almost invaluable in such a business. But Tappet had ever found him deficient in this, that he had a certain objectionable pride in having been Bungall's servant, and that as such he thought himself absolved from the necessity of subserviency to his latter master. Once a day indeed he did touch his cap, but when that was done he seemed to fancy that he was almost equal to Mr. Tappet upon the premises. He never shook in his shoes if Tappet were angry, nor affected to hasten his steps if Tappet were in a hurry, nor would he even laugh at Tappet's jokes if, as was too usual, such jokes were not mirth-moving in their intrinsic nature. Clearly he was not at all points a good servant, and Tappet in some hours of his prosperity had ventured to think that the brewery could go on without him. Now, since the day in which Rowan's treachery had first loomed upon Tappet, he had felt much inclined to fraternize on easier terms with his foreman. Worts, when he touched his cap, had been received with a smile, and his advice had been asked in a flattering tone, not demanded as belonging to the establishment by right. Then Tappet began to talk of Rowan to his man, and to speak evil things of him, as was natural, expecting a reciprocity of malignity from Worts. But Worts on such occasions had been ominously silent. I bean't so sure that," Worts had once said, thus differing from his master on some fundamental point of Tappet's strategy as opposed to Rowan's strategy. "Ain't you?" said Tappet, showing his teeth. "You'd better go now and look after those men at the carts." Worts had looked after the men at the carts, but he had done so with an idea in his head that perhaps he would not long look after Tappet's men or Tappet's carts. He had not himself been ambitious of good beer, but the idea had almost startled him into acquiescence by its brilliancy. Now Worts had a vote in the borough, and it came to Tappet's ears that his servant intended to give that vote to Mr. Cornbury. "Worts," said he, a day or two before the election, "of course you intend to vote for Mr. Hart?" Worts touched his cap, for it was the commencement of the day. "I don't jest know," said he. "I was thinking of woting for the young squire. I've known him ever since he was born, and I ain't never knowed the Jew gentleman, never at all." "Look here, Worts, if you intend to remain in this establishment, I shall expect you to support the Liberal interest as I support it myself. The Liberal interest has always been supported in Baselhurst by Bungall and Tappet, ever since Bungall and Tappet have existed." "The old maester, he wouldn't have woted for e'er a Jew in Christendom, not agin the squire. The old maester was allays for the Protestant religion." "Very well, Worts, there can't be two ways of thinking here, that's all, especially not at such a time as this, when there's more reason than ever why those connected with the brewery should all stand shoulder to shoulder. You've had your bread out of this establishment, Worts, for a great many years." "And I've earned it hard. No man can say otherwise. The sweat of my body belongs to the brewery, but I didn't ever sell 'em my wote, and I don't mean," saying which words, with an emphasis that was by no means servile, Wertz went out from the presence of his master. "That man's turning against me," said Tappett to his wife at breakfast time, in almost mute despair. "What, Wertz?" said Mrs. Tappett. "Yes, the ungrateful hound. He's been about the place almost ever since he could speak, for more than 40 years. He's had £2 a week for the last 10 years, and now he's turning against me." "Is he going over to Rowan?" "I don't know where he's going. He's going to vote for Butler Cornbury, and that's enough for me." "Oh, T., I wouldn't mind that, especially not just now. Only think what a help he'll be to that man." "I tell you he shall walk out of the brewery the week after this if he votes for Cornbury. There isn't room for two opinions here, and I won't have it." For a moment or two Mrs. Tappett sat mute, almost in despair. Then she took courage and spoke out. "T," said she, "it won't do." "What won't do?" "All this won't do. We shall be ruined and left without a home. I don't mind myself, I never did, but think of the girls. What would they do if we was turned out of this?" "Who's to turn you out?" "I know, I see it, I am beginning to understand, T. That man would not go against you in the brewery if he didn't know which way the wind is blowing. Wertz is wide awake, quite wide. He always was. T., you must take the offer Rowan has made of a regular income and live retired. If you don't do it, I shall." And Mrs. Tappett, as she spoke the audacious words, rose up from her chair and stood with her arms leaning upon the table. "What?" said Tappett, sitting aghast, with his mouth open. "Yes, T., if you don't think of your family, I must. What I'm saying Mr. Honeyman has said before, and indeed all Baslehurst is saying the same thing. There's an offer made to you that will put your family on a footing quite genteel. No gentlefolks in the county more so. And you, too, that are getting past your work." "I ain't getting past my work." "I shouldn't say so, T., if it weren't for your own good. And if I'm not to know about that, who is? It's all very well going about electioneering, and indeed it's just what gentlefolks is fit for when they're past their regular work. And I'm sure I shan't begrudge it so long as it don't cost anything. But that's not work, you know, T." "Ain't I in the brewery every day for 7 or 8 hours, and often more?" "Yes, T., you are. And what's like to come of it if you go on so? What would be my feelings if I saw you brought into the house struck down with apoplexy and paralepsy because I let you go on in that way when you wasn't fit? No, T., I know my duty, and I mean to do it. You know Dr. Hoster said only last month that you were that bilious." "Sure, bilious. It's enough to make any man bilious." Or any dog, he would have added, had he thought of it. Thereupon Tappett rushed away from his wife back into his little office, and from that soon made his way to the Jews' committee room at the Dragon, at which he was detained till nearly 11 o'clock at night. "It's a kind of work in which one has to do as much after dinner as before," he said to his wife when he got back. "For the matter of that," said she, "I think the after-dinner work is the chief part of it." On the day of the election, Luke Rowan was to be seen standing in the High Street talking to Butler Cornbury, the candidate. Rowan was not an elector, for the cottages had not been in his possession long enough to admit of his obtaining from them a qualification to vote, but he was a declared friend of the Cornbury party. Mrs. Butler Cornbury had sent a message to him saying that she hoped to see him soon after the election should be over, on the following day or on the next, and Butler Cornbury himself had come to him in the town. Though absent from Baselhurst, Rowan had managed to declare his opinions before that time, and was suspected by many to have written those articles in the Baselhurst Gazette which advocated the right of any constituency to send a Jew to Parliament if it pleased, but which proved at the same time that any constituency must be wrong to send any Jew to Parliament, and that the constituency of Baselhurst would, in the present instance, be specially wrong to send Mr. Hart to Parliament. "We have always advocated," said one of these articles, "the right of absolute freedom of choice for every borough and every county in the land. But we trust that the day is far distant in which the electors of England shall cease to look to their nearest neighbours as their best representatives." There wasn't much in the argument, but it suited the occasion, and added strength to Rowan's own cause in the borough. All the staunch Protestants began to feel a want of good beer. Questions very ill-natured as toward Tappet were asked in the newspapers. Who owns the spotted dog at Busby Porcorum, and who compels the landlord to buy his liquor at Tappet's Brewery? There were scores of questions of the same nature, all of which Tappet attributed, wrongly, to Luke Rowan. Luke had written that article about freedom of election, but he had not condescended to notice the beer at the Spotted Dog. And there was another quarrel taking place in Baselhurst on the score of that election, between persons with whom we are connected in this story. Mr. Prong had a vote in the borough, and was disposed to make use of it, and Mrs. Prime, regarding her own position as Mr. Prong's affianced bride, considered herself at liberty to question Mr. Prong as to the use which he proposed to make of that vote. To Mrs. Prime it appeared that anything done in any direction for the benefit of a Jew was a sin not to be forgiven. To Mr. Prong it seemed to be as great a sin not to do anything in his power for the hindrance and vexation of those with whom Dr. Harford and Mr. Comfort were connected by ties of friendship. Mrs. Prime, who, of the two, was the more logical, would not disjoin her personal and her scriptural hatreds. She also hated Dr. Harford, but she hated the Jews more. She was not disposed to support a Jew in Baselhurst, because Mr. Comfort in his doctrines had fallen away from the purity of his early promise. Her idea was that a just man and a good Christian could not vote for either of the Baselhurst candidates under the present unhappy local circumstances, but that under no circumstances should a Christian vote for a Jew. All this she said in a voice not so soft as should be the voice of a woman to her betrothed. "Dorothea," said Mr. Prong very solemnly. They were sitting at the time in his own little front parlour, as to the due arrangement of the furniture in which Mrs. Prime had already ventured to make some slight alterations which had not been received favourably by Mr. Prong. "Dorothea, in this matter you must allow me to be the best judge. Voting for members of Parliament is a thing which ladies naturally are not called upon to understand." "Ladies can understand as well as gentlemen," said Mrs. Prime, "that a curse has gone out from the Lord against that people, and gentlemen have no more right than ladies to go against the will of the Lord." It was in vain that Mr. Prong endeavoured to explain to her that the curse attached to the people as a nation, and did not necessarily follow units of that people who had adopted other nationalities. "Let the units become Christians before they go into Parliament," said Mrs. Prime. "I wish they would," said Mr. Prong. "I heartily wish they would. And Mr. Hart, if he be returned, shall have my prayers." But this did not at all suffice for Mrs. Prime, who perhaps in the matter of argument had the best of it. She told her betrothed to his face that he was going to commit a great sin, and that he was tempted to this sin by grievous worldly passions. When so informed, Mr. Prong closed his eyes, crossed his hands meekly on his breast, and shook his head. "Not from thee, Dorothea," said he. "Not from thee should this have come." "Who is to speak out to you if I am not?" said she. But Mr. Prong sat in silence, and with closed eyes again shook his head. "Perhaps we had better part," said Mrs. Prime, after an interval of 5 minutes. "Perhaps it will be better for both of us." Mr. Prong, however, still shook his head in silence, and it was difficult for a lady in Mrs. Prime's position to read accurately the meaning of such shakings under such circumstances. But Mrs. Prime was a woman sufficiently versed in the world's business to be able to resolve that she would have an answer to her question when she required an answer. "Mr. Prong," she said, "I remarked just now that perhaps we had better part." "I heard the words," said Mr. Prong. "I heard the cruel words." But even then he did not open his eyes or remove his hands from his breast. "I heard the words, and I heard those other words, still more cruel. You had better leave me now, that I may humble myself in prayer." "That's all very well, Mr. Prong, and I'm sure I hope you will. But situated as we are, of course I should choose to have an answer. It seems to me that you dislike that kind of interference which I regard as a wife's best privilege and sweetest duty. If this be so, it will be better for us to part. As friends, of course." "You have accused me of a great sin," he said, "of a great sin, of a great sin." "And so in my mind it would be." "Judge not, lest ye be judged, Dorothea. Remember that." "That doesn't mean, Mr. Prong, that we are not to have our opinions, and that we are not to warn those who are near us when we see them walking in the wrong path. I might as well say the same thing to you when you—" "No, Dorothea, it is my bounden duty. It is my work. It is that to which I am appointed as a minister. If you cannot see the difference, I have much mistaken your character, have much mistaken your character." "Do you mean to say that nobody but a clergyman is to know what's right and what's wrong? That must be nonsense, Mr. Prong. I'm sorry to say anything to grieve you." Mr. Prong was now shaking his head again, with his eyes most pertinaciously closed. "But there are some things which really one can't bear." But he only shook his head. His inward feelings were too many for him, so that he could not at the present moment bring himself to give a reply to the momentous proposition which his betrothed had made him. Nor, indeed, had he at this moment fixed his mind as to the step which duty and wisdom combined would call upon him to take in this matter. The temper of the lady was not certainly all that he had desired. As an admiring member of his flock, she had taken all his ghostly counsels as infallible, but now it seemed to him as though most of his words and many of his thoughts and actions were made subject by her to a bitter criticism. But in this matter he was inclined to rely much upon his own strength. Should he marry the lady, as he was still minded to do for many reasons, he would be to her a loving, careful husband. But he would also be her lord and master, as was intended when marriage was made a holy ordinance. In this respect he did not doubt himself or his own powers. Hard words he could bear, and, as he thought, after a time, control. So thinking, he was not disposed to allow the lady to recede from her troth to him, simply because in her anger she expressed a wish to do so. Therefore he had wisely been silent, and had shaken his head in reproach. But unfortunately the terms of their compact had not been finally settled with reference to another heading. Mrs. Prime had promised to be his wife, but she had burdened her promise with certain pecuniary conditions which were distasteful to him, which were much opposed to that absolute headship and perfect mastery which, as he thought, should belong to the husband as husband. His views on this subject were very strong, and he was by no means inclined to abate one jot of his demand. Better remain single in his work than accept the name of husband without its privileges. But he had hoped that by mingled firmness and gentle words he might bring his Dorothea round to a more womanly way of thinking. He had flattered himself that there was a power of eloquence in him which would have prevailed over her. Once or twice he thought that he was on the brink of success. He knew well that there were many points in his favour. A woman who has spoken of herself, and been spoken of as being on the point of marriage, does not like to recede, and his Dorothea, though not specially womanly among women, was still a woman. Moreover, he had the law on his side, the old law as coming from the Scriptures. He could say that such a pecuniary arrangement as that proposed by his Dorothea was sinful. He had said so, as he had then thought not without effect, but now she retaliated upon him with accusation of another sin. It was manifestly in her power to break away from him on that money detail. It seemed now to be her wish to break away from him, but she preferred doing so on that other matter. He began to fear that he must lose his wife, seeing that he was resolved never to yield on the money question. But he did not choose to be entrapped into an instant resignation of his engagement by Dorothea's indignation on a point of abstruse scripturo-political morality. His Dorothy had assumed her indignation as a cloak for her pecuniary obstinacy. It might be that he must yield, but he would not surrender thus at the sound of a false summons. So he closed his eyes very pertinaciously and shook his head. "I think upon the whole," said she again, "that we had better make up our minds to part." Then she stood up, feeling that she should thus employ a greater power in forcing an answer from him. He must have seen her motion through some cranny of his pertinaciously closed eyes, for he noticed it by rising from his own chair, with both his hands firmly fixed upon the table, but still he did not open his eyes, unless it might be to the extent of that small cranny. "Good-bye, Mr. Prong," said she. Then he altered the form of his hands, and taking them from the table he dashed them together before his face. "God bless you, Dorothea," said he. "God bless you, God bless you." And he put out his hands as though blessing her in his darkness. She, perceiving the inutility of endeavouring to shake hands with a man who wouldn't open his eyes, moved away from her chair towards the door, purposely raising a sound of motion with her dress, so that he might know that she was going. In that, I think, she took an unnecessary precaution, for the cranny at the corner of his eye was still at his disposal. "Good-bye, Mr. Prong," she said again, as she opened the door for herself. "God bless you, Dorothea," said he. "May God bless you." Then, without assistance at the front door, she made her way out into the street, and as she stepped along the pavement she formed a resolve, which no eloquence from Mr. Prong could ever overcome, that she would remain a widow for the rest of her days. At 12 o'clock on the morning of the election, Mr. Hart was declared by his own committee to be 9 ahead, and was admitted to be 6 ahead by Mr. Cornbury's committee. But the Cornbury folk asserted confidently that in this they saw certain signs of success. Their supporters were not men who could be whipped up to the poll early in the day, whereas Hart's voters were all, more or less, under control, and had been driven up hurriedly to the hustings so as to make this early show of numbers. Mr. Hart was about everywhere speaking, and so was Butler Cornbury, but in the matter of oratory I'm bound to acknowledge that the Jew had by much the mastery over the Christian. There are a class of men, or rather more than a class, a section of mankind, to whom a power of easy expression by means of spoken words comes naturally. English country gentlemen, highly educated as they are, undaunted as they usually are, self-confident as they in truth are at the bottom, are clearly not in this section. Perhaps they are further removed from it, considering the advantages they have for such speaking, than any other class of men in England, or I might almost say elsewhere. The fact, for it is a fact, that some of the greatest orators whom the world has known have been found in this class, does not in any degree affect the truth of my proposition. The best grapes in the world are perhaps grown in England, though England is not a land of grapes. And for the same reason. The value of the thing depends on its rarity, and its value instigates the efforts for excellence. The power of vocal expression, which seems naturally to belong to an American, is, to an ordinary Englishman, very marvelous. But in America the talking man is but little esteemed. "Very wonderful power of delivery, that of Mr. So-and-so," says the Englishman, speaking of an American. "Guess we don't think much of that kind of thing here," says the Yankee. "There's a deal too much of that coin in circulation." English country gentlemen are not to be classed among that section of mankind which speaks easily in public, but Jews, I think, may be so classed. The men who speak thus easily and with natural fluency are also they who learn languages easily. They are men who observe rather than think, who remember rather than create, who may not have great mental powers, but are ever ready with what they have, whose best word is at their command at a moment, and is then serviceable, though perhaps incapable of more enduring service. At any rate, as regarded oratory in Baselhurst, the dark little man with the bright new hat from London was very much stronger than his opponent, so much stronger that poor Butler Cornbury began to sicken of elections and to wish himself comfortably at home at Cornbury Grange. He knew that he was talking himself down, while the Israelitish clothier was talking himself up. "It don't matter," Honeyman said to him comfortably. "It's only done for the show of the thing and to fill up the day. If Gladstone were here he wouldn't talk a vote out of them one way or another, nor yet the devil himself." This consoled Butler Cornbury, but nevertheless he longed that the day might be over. And Tappit spoke too more than once, as did also Luke Rowan, in spite of various noisy interruptions, in which he was told that he was not an elector, and in spite also of an early greeting with a dead cat. Tappit, in advocating the claims of Mr. Hart to be returned to Parliament as member for Baslehurst, was clever enough to introduce the subject of his own wrongs. And so important had this brewery question become that he was listened to with every sign of interest when he told the people for how many years Bungall and Tappit had brewed beer for them there in Baselhurst. Doubtless he was met by sundry interruptions from the Rowanites. "What sort of tipple has it been, T?" was demanded by one voice. "Do you call that beer?" said a second. "Where do you buy your hops?" asked a third. But he went on manfully, and was buoyed up by a strong belief that he was fighting his own battle with success. Nor was Rowan slow to answer him. He was proud to say that he was Bungall's heir, and as such he intended to continue Bungall's business. Whether he could improve the quality of the old tap he didn't know, but he would try. People had said a few weeks ago that he had been hounded out of Baselhurst, and did not mean to come back again. Here he was. He had bought property in Baselhurst. He meant to live in Baselhurst. He pledged himself to brew beer in Baselhurst. He already regarded himself as belonging to Baselhurst, and being a bachelor he hoped that he might live to marry a wife out of Baselhurst. This last assurance was received with unqualified applause from both factions, and went far in obtaining for Rowan that local popularity which was needful to him. Certainly the Rowan contest added much to the popular interest of that election. At the close of the poll on that evening it was declared by the mayor that Mr. Butler Cornbury had been elected to serve the borough in Parliament by a majority of 1 vote.
Section 25 of Rachel Ray. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piper Hayes. Rachel Ray by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 10 of Volume 2, The Baselhurst Gazette. By 1 vote. Old Mr. Cornbury, when he heard of it, gasped with dismay, and in secret regretted that his son had not been beaten. What seat could be gained by one vote and not be contested, especially when the beaten candidate was a Jew clothier rolling in money? And what sums would not a petition and scrutiny cost? Butler Cornbury himself was dismayed, and could hardly participate in the exultation of his more enthusiastic wife. Mr. Hart, of course, declared that he would petition, and that he was as sure of the seat as though he already occupied it. But, as it was known that every possible electioneering device had been put in practice on his behalf during the last 2 hours of the poll, the world at large in Baselhurst believed that young Cornbury's position was secure. Tappit and some few others were of a different opinion. At the present moment Tappit could not endure to acknowledge to himself that he had been beaten. Nothing but the prestige and inward support of immediate success could support him in that contest, so much more important to himself, in which he was now about to be engaged. That matter of the petition, however, can hardly be brought into the present story. The political world will understand that it would be carried on with great vigour. The news of the election of Butler Cornbury reached the cottage at Bragg's End by the voice of Mr. Sturt on the same evening, and Mrs. Ray, in her quiet way, expressed much joy that Mr. Comfort's son-in-law should have been successful, and that Baselhurst should not have disgraced itself by any connection with a Jew. To her it had appeared monstrous that such a one should have been even permitted to show himself in the town as a candidate for its representation. To such she would have denied all civil rights, and almost all social rights. For a true spirit of persecution one should always go to a woman, and the milder, the sweeter, the more loving, the more womanly the woman, the stronger will be that spirit within her. Strong love for the thing loved necessitates strong hatred for the thing hated, and thence comes the spirit of persecution. They in England who are now keenest against the Jews, who would again take from them rights that they have lately won, are certainly those who think most of the faith of a Christian. The most deadly enemies of the Roman Catholics are they who love best their religion as Protestants. When we look to individuals we always find it so, though it hardly suits us to admit as much when we discuss these subjects broadly. To Mrs. Ray it was wonderful that a Jew should have been entertained in Baselhurst as a future member for the borough, and that he should have been admitted to speak aloud within a few yards of the church tower. On the day but one after the election Mrs. Sturt brought over to the cottage an extra sheet of the Baselhurst Gazette, which had been published out of its course, and which was devoted to the circumstances of the election. I am not sure that Mrs. Sturt would have regarded this somewhat dull report of the election speeches as having any particular interest for Mrs. Ray and her daughter, had it not been for one special passage. Luke Rowan's speech about Baselhurst was given at length, and in it was contained that public promise as to his matrimonial intentions. Mrs. Sturt came into the cottage parlour with the paper doubled into 4, and with her finger on a particular spot. To her it had seemed that Rowan's promise must have been intended for Rachel, and it seemed also that nothing could be more manly, straightforward, or gallant than that assurance. It suited her idea of chivalry, but she was not quite sure that Rachel would enjoy the publicity of the declaration, and therefore she was prepared to point the passage out more particularly to Mrs. Ray. "I've brought 'ee the account of it all," said she, still holding the paper in her hand. "The goodman he's done with the paper, and you'll keep it for good and all. One young man that we know of has made the finest speech of 'em all, to my mind. Look at that, Mrs. Ray." Then, with a knowing wink at the mother and a poke at the special words with her finger, she left the sheet in Mrs. Ray's hand and went her way. Mrs. Ray, who had not quite understood the pantomime, and whose eye had not caught the words relating to marriage, saw, however, that the column indicated contained the report of a speech made by Luke Rowan, and she began at the beginning and read it throughout. Luke had identified himself with the paper, and therefore received from it almost more than justice. His words were given at very full length, and for some 10 minutes she was reading before she came to the words which Mrs. Sturt had hoped would be so delightful. "What is it, mamma?" Rachel asked. "A speech, my dear, made at the election." "And who made it, mamma?" Mrs. Ray hesitated for a moment before she answered, thereby letting Rachel know full well who made the speech before the word was spoken. But at last she did speak the word. "Mr. Rowan, my dear." "Oh," said Rachel. She longed to get hold of the newspaper, but she would utter no word expressive of such longing. Since that evening on which she had been bidden to look at the clouds, she had regarded Luke as a special hero, cleverer than other men around her, as a man born to achieve things and make himself known. It was not astonishing to her that a speech of his should be reported at length in the newspaper. He was a man certain to rise, to make speeches, and to be reported. So she thought of him, and so thinking had almost wished that it were not so. Could she expect that such a one would stoop to her? Or that, if he did so, that she could be fit for him? He had now perceived that himself, and therefore had taken her at her word and had left her. Had he been more like other men around her, more homely, less prone to rise, with less about him of fire and genius, she might have won him and kept him. The prize would not have been so precious, but still, she thought, it might have been sufficient for her heart. A young man who could find printers and publishers to report his words in that way, on the first moment of his coming among them, would he turn aside from his path to look after her? Would he not bring with him some grand lady down from London as his wife? "Dear me," said Mrs. Ray, quite startled. "Oh dear, what do you think he says?" "What does he say, mamma?" "Well, I don't know. Perhaps he mayn't mean it. I don't think I ought to have spoken of it. If it's in the newspaper, I suppose I should have heard of it, unless you sent it back without letting me see it. She said we were to keep it, and it's because of that, I'm sure. She was always the most good-natured woman in the world. I don't know what we should have done if we hadn't found such a neighbour as Mrs. Sturt. But what is it, mamma, that you are speaking of in the newspapers?" "Mr. Rowan says—" "Oh dear, I wish I'd let you come to it yourself. How very odd that he should get up and say that kind of thing in public before all the people. He says— But anyway I know he means it because he's so honest. And after all, if he means it, it doesn't much matter where he says it. Handsome is that handsome does. There, my dear, I don't know how to tell it you, so you had better read it yourself." Rachel, with eager hands, took the paper, and began the speech as her mother had done, and read it through. She read it through till she came to those words, and then she put the paper down beside her. "I understand what you mean, mamma, and what Mrs. Sturt meant, but Mr. Rowan did not mean that." "What did he mean, my dear?" "He meant them to understand that he intended to become a man of Baselhurst like one of themselves." "But then why did he talk about finding a wife there?" "He wouldn't have said that, mamma, if he had meant anything particular. If anything of that sort had been at all in his mind, it would have kept him from saying what he did say." "But didn't he mean that he intended to marry a Baselhurst lady?" "He meant it in that sort of way in which men do mean such things. It was his way to make them think well of him. But don't let us talk any more about it, mamma. It isn't nice." "Well, I'm sure I can't understand it," said Mrs. Ray. But she became silent on the subject, and the reading of the newspaper was passed over to Rachel. This had not been completed when a step was heard on the gravel walk outside, and Mrs. Ray, jumping up, declared it to be the step of her eldest daughter. It was so, and Mrs. Prime was very soon in the room. It was at this time about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and therefore, as the hour for tea at the cottage was 5:30, it was naturally understood that Mrs. Prime had come there to join them at their evening meal. After their first greeting she had seated herself on the sofa, and there was that in her manner which showed both to her mother and sister that she was somewhat confused, that she had something to say as to which there was some hesitation. "Do take off your bonnet, Dorothea," said her mother. "Will you come upstairs, Dolly," said her sister, "and put your hair straight after your walk?" But Dolly did not care whether her hair was straight or tossed, as the Irish girls say when the smoothness of their locks has been disarranged. She took off her bonnet, however, and laid it on the sofa beside her. "Mother," she said, "I've got something particular that I want to say to you." "I hope it's not anything serious the matter," said Mrs. Ray. "Well, mother, it is serious. Things are serious mostly, I think, or should be." "Shall I go into the garden while you are speaking to mamma?" said Rachel. "No, Rachel, not on my account. What I've got to say should be said to you as well as to mother. It's all over between me and Mr. Prong." "No," said Mrs. Ray. "I thought it would be," said Rachel. "And why did you think so?" said Mrs. Prime, turning round upon her sister almost angrily. "I felt that he wouldn't suit you, Dolly. That's why I thought so. If it's all over now, I suppose there's no harm in saying that I didn't like him well enough to hope he'd be my brother-in-law. But that couldn't make you think it. However, it's all over between us. We agreed that it should be so this morning, and I thought it right to come out and let you know at once." "I'm glad you've told us," said Mrs. Ray. "Was there any quarrel?" asked Rachel. "No, Rachel, there was no quarrel, not what you call a quarrel, I suppose. We found there were subjects of disagreement between us, matters on which we had adverse opinions, and therefore it was better that we should part." "It was about the money, perhaps?" said Mrs. Ray. "Well, yes, it was in part about the money. Had I known then as much as I do now about the law in such matters, I should have told Mr. Prong from the first that it could not be. He is a good man, and I hope I have not disturbed his happiness." "I used to be afraid that he would disturb yours," said Rachel, "and therefore I cannot pretend to regret it." "That's not charitable, Rachel. But if you please we won't say anything more about it. It's over, and that is enough. And now, mother, I want to know if you will object to my returning here and living at the cottage again." Mrs. Ray could not bethink herself at the moment what answer she might best make, and therefore for some moments she made none. For herself she would have been delighted that her eldest daughter should return to the cottage. Under no circumstances could she refuse her own child a home under her own roof. But at the present moment she could not forget the circumstances under which Mrs. Prime had gone, and it militated sorely against Mrs. Ray's sense of justice that the return should be made to depend on other circumstances. Mrs. Prime had gone away in loud disapproval of Rachel's conduct, and now she proposed to return on this breaking up of her own matrimonial arrangements, as though she had left the cottage because of her proposed marriage. Mrs. Prime should be welcomed back, but her return should be accompanied by a withdrawal of her accusation against Rachel. Mrs. Ray did not know how to put her demand into words, but her mind was clear on the subject. "Well, mother," said Mrs. Prime, "is there any objection?" "No, my dear, no objection at all. Of course not. I shall be delighted to have you back, and so I'm sure will Rachel. But—" "But what? Is it about money?" "Oh dear no, nothing about money at all. If you do come back, and I'm sure I hope you will, and indeed it seems quite unnatural that you should be staying in Baselhurst while we are living here, but I think you ought to say, my dear, that Rachel behaved just as she ought to behave in all that matter about Mr. Rowan, you know." "Don't mind me, mamma," said Rachel, who could, however, have smothered her mother with kisses on hearing these words. "But I think we all ought to understand each other, Rachel. You and your sister can't go on comfortably together if there's to be more black looks about that." "I don't know that there have been any black looks," said Mrs. Prime, looking very black as she spoke. "At any rate, we should understand each other," continued Mrs. Ray, with admirable courage. "I've thought a great deal about it since you've been away. Indeed, I haven't thought about much else, and I don't think I shall ever forgive myself for having let a hard word be said to Rachel about it." "Oh, mamma, don't, said Rachel, but those meditated embraces were continued in her imagination. "I don't want to say any hard words," said Mrs. Prime. "No, I'm sure you don't. Only they were said, weren't they now? Didn't we blame her about being out there in the churchyard that evening?" "Mamma!" exclaimed Rachel. "Well, my dear, I won't say any more, only this. Your sister went away because she thought you weren't good enough for her to live with. And if she comes back again, which I'm sure I hope she will, I think she ought to say that she's been mistaken." Mrs. Prime looked very black, and no word fell from her. She sat there silent and gloomy while Mrs. Ray looked at the fireplace, lost in wonder at her own effort. Whether she would have given way or not, had she and Mrs. Prime been alone, I cannot say. That Mrs. Prime would have uttered no outspoken recantation, I feel sure. It was Rachel at last who settled the matter. "If Dolly comes back to live here, mamma," said she, "I shall take that as an acknowledgment on her part that she thinks I am good enough to live with." "Well, my dear," said Mrs. Ray, "perhaps that'll do. Only there should be an understanding, you know." Mrs. Prime at the moment said nothing, but when next she spoke, her words showed her intention of having her things brought back to the cottage on the next day. I think it must be felt that Rachel had won the victory. She felt it so herself, and was conscious that no Section 26 of Rachel Ray. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piper Hayes. Rachel Ray by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 11 of Volume 2, Cornbury Grange. Luke Rowan had been told that Mrs. Butler Cornbury wished to see him when the election should be over, and on the evening of the election the victorious candidate, before he returned home, asked Luke to come to the Grange on the following Monday and stay till the next Wednesday. Now it must be understood that Rowan during this period of the election had become, in a public way, very intimate with Cornbury. They were both young men, the new member of Parliament not being over 30, and for the time they were together employed on the same matter. Luke Rowan was one with whom such a man as Mr. Cornbury could not zealously cooperate without reaching a considerable extent of personal intimacy. He was pleasant-mannered, free in speech, with a bold eye, assuming though not asserting his equality with the best of those with whom he might be brought in contact. Had Cornbury chosen to consider himself by reason of his social station too high for Rowan's fellowship, he might of course have avoided him, but he could not have put himself into close contact with the man without submitting himself to that temporary equality which Rowan assumed, and to that temporary familiarity which sprung from it. Butler Cornbury had thought little about it. He had found Rowan to be a pleasant associate and an able assistant, and had fallen into that mode of fellowship which the other man's ways and words had made natural to him. When his wife begged him to ask Rowan up to the Grange, he had been startled for a moment, but had at once assented. "Well," said he, "he's an uncommon pleasant fellow. I don't see why he shouldn't come." "I've a particular reason," said Mrs. Butler. "All right," said the husband. "Do you explain it to my father." And so the invitation had been given. But Rowan was a man more thoughtful than Cornbury, and was specially thoughtful as to his own position. He was a radical at heart, if ever there was a radical, But in saying this, I must beg my reader to understand that a radical is not necessarily a revolutionist, or even a republican. He does not, by reason of his social or political radicalism, desire the ruin of thrones, the degradation of nobles, the spoliation of the rich, or even the downfall of the bench of bishops. Many a young man is frightened away from the just conclusions of his mind and the strong convictions of his heart by dread of being classed with those who are jealous of the favored ones of fortune. A radical may be as ready as any aristocrat to support the crown with his blood and the church with his faith. It is in this that he is a radical, that he desires, expects, works for, and believes in the gradual progress of the people. No doctrine of equality is his. Liberty he must have, and such position, high or low, for himself and others, as each man's individual merits will achieve for him. The doctrine of outward equality he eschews as a barrier to all ambition and to all improvement. The idea is as mean as the thing is impracticable. But within, is it in his soul or in his heart? Within his breast there is a manhood that will own no inferiority to the manhood of another. He retires to a corner that an earl with his suite may pass proudly through the doorway, and he grudges the earl nothing of his pride. It is the earl's right, but he also has his right, and neither queen nor earl nor people shall invade it. That is the creed of a radical. Rowan, as I have said, was a man thoughtful as to his own position. He had understood well the nature of the league between himself and Butler Cornbury. It was his intention to become a brewer in Baselhurst, and a brewer in Baslehurst would by no means be as the mighty brewers of great name, who marry lords' daughters and give their daughters in marriage to mighty lords. He would simply be a tradesman in the town. It might well be that he should not find the society of the Tappets and the Griggses much to his taste, but such as it was he would make the best of it. At any rate, he would make no attempt to force his way into other society. If others came to him, let that be their lookout. Now, when Cornbury asked him thus to come to Cornbury Grange, as though they two were men living in the same class of life, as though they were men who might be bound together socially in their homes, as well as politically on the hustings, the red colour came to his face, and he hesitated for a moment in his answer. "You are very kind," said he. "Oh, you must come," said Cornbury. "My wife particularly desires it." "She is very kind," said he, "but if you ask all your supporters over to the Grange, you'll get rather a mixed lot." "I suppose I should, but I don't mean to do that. I shall be very glad, however, to see you, very glad." "And I shall be very happy to come," said Rowan, having again hesitated as he gave his answer. "I wish I hadn't promised that I'd go there," he said to himself afterwards. This was on the Sunday, after evening church, an hour or more after the people had all gone home, and he was sitting on that stile, looking to the west, and thinking, as he looked, of that sunset which he and another had seen as they stood there together. He did wish that he had not undertaken to go to Mr. Cornbury's house. What to him would be the society of such people as he should find there? To him who had laid out for himself a career that would necessarily place his life among other associates. "I'll send and excuse myself," he said. "I'll be called away to Exeter. I have things to do there. I shall only get into a mess by knowing people who will drop me when this ferment of the election is over." And yet the idea of an intimacy at such a house as Cornbury Grange, with such people as Mrs. Butler Cornbury, was very sweet to him. Only this, that if he associated with them or such as them, it must be on equal terms. He could acknowledge them to be people apart from him, as ice creams and sponge cakes are things apart from the shillingless schoolboy. But as the schoolboy, if brought within the range of cakes and creams, must devour them with unchecked relish, as though his pocket were lined with coin, so must he, Rowan, carry himself with these curled darlings of society if he found himself placed among them. He liked cakes and creams, but had made up his mind that other viands were as wholesome and more comfortably within his reach. Was it worth his while to go to this banquet which would unsettle his taste, and at which perhaps, if he sat there at his ease, he might not be wholly welcome? All his thoughts were not noble. He had declared to himself that a certain thing could not be his except at a cost which he would not pay, and yet he hankered for that thing. He had declared to himself that no social position in which he might ever find himself should make a change in him, on his inner self or on his outward manner, and now he feared to go among these people, lest he should find himself an inferior among superiors. It was not all noble, but there was beneath it a basis of nobility. "I will go," he said at last, fearing that if he did not there would have been some grain of cowardice in the motives of his action. "If they don't like me, it's their fault for asking me." Of course, as he sat there he was thinking of Rachel. Of course he had thought of Rachel daily, almost hourly, since he had been with her at the cottage, when she had bent her head over his shoulder and submitted to have his arm round her waist. But his thoughts of her were not as hers of him. Nor is it often that a man's love is like a woman's, restless, fearful, uncomfortable, sleepless, timid, and all-pervading. Not the less may it be passionate, constant, and faithful. He had been angered by Rachel's letter to him, greatly angered. Of a truth, when Mrs. Ray met him in Exeter, he had no message to send back to Cawston. He had done his part and had been rejected too clearly, because on the summing up of his merits and demerits at the cottage, his demerits had been found to be the heavier. He did not suspect that the calculation had been made by Rachel herself, and therefore he had never said to himself that all should be over between them. He had never determined that there should be a quarrel between them, but he was angered, and he would stand aloof from her. He would stand aloof from her, and would no longer acknowledge that he was in any way bound by the words he had spoken. All such bonds she had broken. Nevertheless, I think he loved her with a surer love after receiving that letter than he had ever felt before. He had been here at this spot every evening since his return to Baselhurst, and here had thought much of his future life, and something too of the days that were past. Looking to the left he could see the trees that stood in front of the old brewery, hiding the building from his eyes. That was the house in which old Bungle had lived, and there Tappit had lived for the last 20 years. "I suppose," said he, speaking to himself, "it will be my destiny to live there too, with the vats and beer barrels under my nose. But what farmer ever throve who disliked the muck of his own farmyard?" Then he had thought of Tappit, and of the coming battle, and had laughed as he remembered the scene with the poker. At that moment his eye caught the bright colours of women's bonnets coming into the field beneath him, and he knew that the Tappit girls were returning home from their walk. He had retired quickly round the chancel of the church, and had watched, thinking that Rachel would be with them. But Rachel, of course, was not there. He said to himself that they had thrown her off, and said also that the time should come when they should be glad to win from her a kind word and an encouraging smile. His love for Rachel was as true and more strong than ever, but it was of that nature that he was able to tell himself that it had, for the present moment, been set aside by her act, and that it became him to leave it for a while in abeyance. "What on earth shall I do with myself all Tuesday?" he said again, as he walked away from the churchyard on the Sunday evening. "I don't know what these people do with themselves when there's no hunting and shooting. It seems unnatural to me that a man shouldn't have his bread to earn, or a woman either in some form." After that he went back to his inn. On the Monday he went out to Cornbury Grange late in the afternoon. Butler Cornbury drove into Baselhurst with a pair of horses, and took him back in his phaeton. "Give my fellow your portmanteau. That's all right. You never were at the Grange, were you?" "It's the prettiest 5 miles of a drive in Devonshire, but the walk along the river is the prettiest walk in England, which is saying a great deal more." "I know the walk well," said Rowan, "though I never was inside the park." "It isn't much of a park. Indeed, there isn't a semblance of a park about it. Grange is just the name for it, as it's an upper class sort of homestead for a gentleman farmer. We've lived there since long before Adam, but we've never made much of a house of it." "That's just the sort of place that I should like to have myself." "If you had it you wouldn't be content. You'd want to pull down the house and build a bigger one. It's what I shall do some day, I suppose. But if I do it will never be so pretty again. I suppose that fellow will petition, won't he?" "I should say he would, though he won't get anything by it. He knows his purse is longer than ours, and he'll think to frighten us. And by George he will frighten us too. My father is not a rich man by any means." "You should stand to your guns now." "I mean to do so if I can. My wife's father is made of money." "What, Mr. Comfort?" "Yes. He's been blessed with the most surprising number of unmarried uncles and aunts that ever a man had. He's rather fond of me, and likes the idea of my being in Parliament. I think I shall hint to him that he must pay for the idea. Here we are. Will you come and take a turn round the place before dinner?" Rowan was then taken into the house and introduced to the old squire, who received him with the stiff urbanity of former days. "You are welcome to the Grange, Mr. Rowan. You'll find us very quiet here, which is more, I believe, than can have been said of Baselhurst these last 2 or 3 days. My daughter-in-law is somewhere with the children. She'll be here before dinner. Butler, has that tailor fellow gone back to London yet?" Butler told his father that the tailor had at least gone away from Baselhurst, and then the 2 younger men went out and walked about the grounds till dinner time. It was Mrs. Butler Cornbury who gave soul and spirit to daily life at Cornbury Grange, who found the salt with which the bread was quickened, and the wine with which the heart was made glad. Marvellous is the power which can be exercised almost unconsciously over a company or an individual, or even upon a crowd, by one person gifted with good temper, good digestion, good intellects, and good looks. A woman so endowed charms not only by the exercise of her own gifts, but she endows those who are near her with a sudden conviction that it is they whose temper, health, talents, and appearance is doing so much for society. Mrs. Butler Cornbury was such a woman as this. The Grange was a popular house. The old squire was not found to be very dull. The young squire was thought to be rather clever. The air of the house was lively and bracing. Men and women did not find the days there to be overlong, and Mrs. Butler Cornbury did it all. Rowan did not see her till he met her in the drawing-room just before dinner, when he found that 2 or 3 other ladies were also staying there. She came up to him when he entered the room, and greeted him as though he were an old friend. All conversation at that moment, of course, had reference to the election. Thanks were given and congratulations received, and when old Mr. Cornbury shook his head, his daughter-in-law assured him that there would be nothing to fear. "I don't know what you call nothing to fear, my dear. I call £2,000 a great deal to fear." "I shouldn't wonder if we don't hear another word about him," said she. The old man uttered a long sigh. "It seems to me," said he, "that no gentleman ought to stand for a seat in Parliament since these people have been allowed to come up. Purity of election, indeed! It makes me sick. Come along, my dear." Then he gave his arm to one of the young ladies and toddled into the dining-room. Mrs. Butler Cornbury said nothing special to Luke Rowan on that evening, but she made the hours very pleasant to him. All those half-morbid ideas as to social difference between himself and his host's family soon vanished. The house was very comfortable, the girls were very pretty, Mrs. Cornbury was very kind, and everything went very well. On the following morning it was nearly 10 when they sat down to breakfast, and half the morning before lunch had passed away in idle chat before the party bethought itself of what it should do for the day. At last it was agreed that they would all stroll out through the woods up to a special reach of the river which there ran through a ravine of rock called Cornbury Cleeves. Many in those parts declared that Cornbury Cleeves was the prettiest spot in England. I am not prepared to bear my testimony to the truth of that very wide assertion. I can only say that I know no prettier spot. The river here was rapid and sparkling, not rapid because driven into small compass, for its breadth was greater and more regular in its passage through the Cleeves than it was either above or below, but rapid from the declivity of its course. On one side the rocks came sheer down to the water, but on the other there was a strip of meadow, or rather a grassy amphitheatre, for the wall of rocks at the back of it was semicircular, so as to enclose the field on every side. There might be 4 or 5 acres of green meadow here, but the whole was so interspersed with old stunted oak trees and thorns standing alone that the space looked larger than it was. The rocks on each side were covered here and there with the richest foliage, and the spot might be taken to be a valley from which, as from that of Rasselas, there was no escape. Down close upon the margin of the water a bathing house had been built, from which a plunge could be taken into 6 or 7 feet of the coolest, darkest, cleanest water that a bather could desire in his heart. "I suppose you were never here before," said Mrs. Cornbury to Rowan. "Indeed I have," said he. "I always think it such a grand thing that you landed magnates can't keep all your delights to yourself. I dare say I've been here oftener than you have during the last 3 months." "That's very likely, seeing that it's my first visit this summer." "And I've been here a dozen times. I suppose you'll think I'm a villainous trespasser when I tell you that I've bathed in that very house more than once." "Then you've done more than I ever did, and yet we made it thinking it would do for the ladies. But the water looks so black." "Ah, I like that, as long as it's a clear black." "I like bathing where I can see the bright stones like jewels at the bottom. You can never do that in fresh water. It's only in some nook of the sea where there is no sand, when the wind outside has died away, and when the tide is quiet and at its full. Then one can drop gently in and almost fancy that one belongs to the sea as the mermaids do. I wonder how the idea of mermaids first came." "Someone saw a crowd of young women bathing." "But then how came they to have looking-glasses and fishes' tails?" "The fishes' tails were taken as granted because they were in the sea, and the looking-glasses because they were women," said Rowan. "And the one with as much reason as the other. By the by, Mr. Rowan, talking of women, and fishes' tails, and looking-glasses, and all other feminine attractions, when did you see Miss Ray last?" Rowan paused before he answered her, and looking round perceived that he had strayed with Mrs. Cornbury to the furthest end of the meadow, away from their companions. It immediately came across his mind that this was the matter on which Mrs. Cornbury wished to speak to him, and by some combative process he almost resolved that he would not be spoken to on that matter. "When did I see Miss Ray?" said he, repeating her question. 2 or 3 days after Mrs. Tappitt's party. I have not seen her since that." "And why don't you go and see her?" said Mrs. Cornbury. Now this was asked him in a tone which made it necessary that he should either answer her question or tell her simply that he would not answer it. The questioner's manner was so firm, so eager, so incisive, that the question could not be turned away. "I am not sure that I am prepared to tell you," said he. "Ah, but I want you to be prepared," said she. "Or rather, perhaps, to tell the truth, I want to drive you to an answer without preparation. Is it not true that you made her an offer, and that she accepted it?" Rowan thought a moment, and then he answered her. "It is true." "I should not have asked the question if I had not positively known that such was the case. I have never spoken a word to her about it, and yet I knew it. Her mother told my father." "Well?" "And as that is so, why do you not go and see her? I am sure you are not one of those who would play such a trick as that upon such a girl, with the mere purpose of amusing yourself." "Upon no girl would I do so, Mrs. Cornbury." "I feel sure of it. Therefore, why do you not go to her?" They walked along together for a few minutes under the rocks in silence, and then Mrs. Cornbury again repeated her question. "Why do you not go to her?" "Mrs. Cornbury," he said, "you must not be angry with me if I say that that is a matter which at the present moment I am not willing to discuss." "Nor must you be angry with me if, as Rachel's friend, I say something further about it. As you do not wish to answer me, I will ask no other question. But at any rate you will be willing to listen to me. Rachel has never spoken to me on this subject, not a word, but I know from others who see her daily that she is very unhappy." "I am grieved that it should be so." "Yes, I knew you would be grieved, but how could it be otherwise? A girl, you know, Mr. Rowan, has not other things to occupy her mind as a man has. I think of Rachel Ray that she would have been as happy there at Bragg's End as the day is long if no offer of love had come in her way. She was not a girl whose head had been filled with romance, and who looked for such things, but for that very reason is she less able to bear the loss of it when the offer has come in her way. I think, perhaps, you hardly know the depth of her character and the strength of her love." "I think I know that she is constant." "Then why do you try her so hardly?" Mrs. Cornbury had promised that she would ask no more questions, but the asking of questions was her easiest mode of saying that which she had to say, and Rowan, though he had declared that he would answer no question, could hardly avoid the necessity of doing so. "It may be that the trial is the other way." "I know. I understand. They made her write a letter to you. It was my father's doing. I will tell you the whole truth. It was my father's doing, and therefore it is that I think myself bound to speak to you. Her mother came to him for advice, and he had heard evil things spoken of you in Baselhurst. You will see that I am very frank with you. And I will take some credit to myself too. I believed such tidings to be altogether false, and I made inquiry which proved that I was right. But my father had given the advice which he thought best. I do not know what Rachel wrote to you, but a girl's letter under such circumstances can hardly do more than express the will of those who guide her. It was sad enough for her to be forced to write such a letter, but it will be sadder still if you cannot be brought to forgive it." Then she paused, standing under the grey rock and looking up eagerly into his face. But he made her no answer, nor gave her any sign. His heart was very tender at that moment towards Rachel, but there was that in him of the stubbornness of manhood which would not let him make any sign of his tenderness. "I will not press you to say anything, Mr. Rowan," she continued, "and I am much obliged to you for having listened to me. I've known Rachel Ray for many years, and that must be my excuse." "No excuse is wanting," he said. "If I do not say anything it is not because I am offended. There are things on which a man should not allow himself to speak without considering them." "Oh, certainly. Come, shall we go back to them at the bathing house? They'll think we've lost ourselves." Thus Mrs. Cornbury said the words which she had desired to speak on Rachel Ray's behalf. When they reached the Grange there was still 2 hours left before the time of dressing for dinner should come, and during these hours Luke returned by himself to the Cleeves. He escaped from his host and retraced his steps, and on reaching the river sat himself down on the margin, and looked into the cool dark running water. Had he been severe to Rachel? He would answer no such question when asked by Mrs. Cornbury, but he was very desirous of answering it to himself. The women at the cottage had doubted him, Mrs. Ray and her daughter, with perhaps that other daughter of whom he had only heard, and he had resolved that they should see him no more and hear of him no more till there should be no further room for doubt. Then he would show himself again at the cottage, and again ask Rachel to be his wife. There was some manliness in this, but there was also a hardness in his pride which deserved the rebuke which Mrs. Cornbury's words had conveyed to him. He had been severe to Rachel. Lying there with his full length stretched upon the grass, he acknowledged to himself that he had thought more of his own feelings than of hers. While Mrs. Cornbury had been speaking he could not bring himself to feel that this was the case. But now in his solitude he did acknowledge it. What amount of sin had she committed against him that she should be so punished by him who loved her? He took out her letter from his pocket, and found that her words were loving, though she had not been allowed to put into them that eager, pressing, speaking love which he had desired. "Spoken ill of me, have they?" said he to himself, as he got up to walk back to the Grange. Well, that was natural too. What an ass a man is to care for such things as that. On that evening and the next morning the Cornburys were very gracious.
Section 27 of Rachel Ray. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Stevens. Rachel Ray by Anthony Trollope. Section 27, in which the question of the brewery is settled. During the day or two immediately subsequent to the election, Mr. Tappit found himself to be rather downhearted. The excitement of the contest was over. He was no longer buoyed up by the consoling and almost triumphant assurances of success for himself against his enemy Rowan, which had been administered to him by those with whom he had been acting on behalf of Mr. Hart. He was alone and thoughtful in his counting-house, or else subjected to the pressure of his wife's arguments in his private dwelling. He had never yet been won over to say that he would agree to any proposition, but he knew that he must now form some decision. Rowan would not even wait till the lawsuit should be decided by legal means. If Mr. Tappit would not consent to one of the 3 propositions made to him, Rowan would at once commence the building of his new brewery. "He is that sort of man," said Honeyman, "that if he puts a brick down, nothing in the world will prevent him from going on." "Of course it won't," said Mrs. Tappit. Oh dear, T. If you go on in this way, we shall all be ruined, and then people will say that it was my fault, and that I ought to have had you inquired into about your senses." Tappit gnashed his teeth and rushed out of the dining-room back into his brewery. Among all those who were around him there was not one to befriend him. Even Worts had turned against him, and had received notice to go with a stern satisfaction which Tappit had perfectly understood. Tappit was in this frame of mind, and was seated on his office stool, with his hat over his eyes, when he was informed by one of the boys about the place that a deputation from the town had come to wait upon him. So he pulled off his hat, and begged that the deputation might be shown into the counting-house. The deputation consisted of 3 tradesmen, who were desirous of convening a meeting with the view of discussing the petition against Mr. Cornbury's return to Parliament, and they begged that Mr. Tappit would take the chair. The meeting was to be held at the Dragon, and it was proposed that after the meeting there should be a little dinner.
Mr. Tappit would perhaps consent to take the chair at the dinner also. Mr. Tappit did consent to both propositions, and when the deputation withdrew, he felt himself to be himself once more. His courage had returned to him, and he would at once rebuke his wife for the impropriety of the words she had addressed to him. He would rebuke his wife, and would then proceed to meet Mr. Sharpit, the attorney, at the Dragon, and to take the chair at the meeting. It could not be that a young adventurer such as Rowan could put down an old established firm such as his own, or banish from the scene of his labours a man of such standing in the town as himself. It was all the fault of Honeyman who never was firm on any matter. When the meeting should be over, he would say a word or two to Sharpit, and see if he could not put the matter into better training. With a heavy tread, a tread that was intended to mark his determination, he ascended to the drawing-room, and from thence to the bedroom above, in which Mrs. Tappit was then seated. She understood the meaning of the footfall, and knew well that it indicated a purpose of marital authority. A woman must have much less of natural wit than had fallen to Mrs. Tappit's share, who has not learned from the experience of 30 years the meaning of such marital signs and sounds. So she sat herself firmly in her seat, caught hold of the petticoat which she was mending with a stout grasp, and prepared herself for the battle. "Margaret," said he, when he had carefully closed the door behind him, "I have come up to say that I do not intend to dine at home to-day." "Oh, indeed," said she. "At the Dragon, I suppose, then?" "Yes, at the Dragon. I've been asked to take the chair at a popular meeting which is to be held with reference to the late election." "Take the chair?" "Yes, my dear, take the chair at the meeting and at the dinner." "Now, T., don't you make a fool of yourself." "No, I won't. But, Margaret, I must tell you once and for all that that is not the way in which I like you to speak to me. Why you should have so much less confidence in my judgment than other people in Baselhurst I cannot conceive, but, now, T., look here. As for your taking the chair, as you call it, of course you can do it if you like it." "Of course I can, and I do like it, and I mean to do it. But it isn't only about that I've come to speak to you. You said something to me to-day before Honeyman that was very improper." "What I say is always improper, I know." "I don't suppose you could have intended to insinuate that you thought I was a lunatic." "I didn't say so." "You said something like it." "No, I didn't, T." "Yes, you did, Margaret." "If you'll allow me for a moment, T., I'll tell you what I did say, and if you wish it, I'll say it again." "No, I'd rather not hear it said again." "But, T., I don't choose to be misunderstood, nor yet misrepresented." "I haven't misrepresented you." "But I say you have misrepresented me. If I ain't allowed to speak a word, of course it isn't any use for me to open my mouth. I hope I know what my duty is, and I hope I have done it, both by you, T., and by the children. I know I'm bound to submit, and I hope I have submitted. Very hard it has been sometimes when I've seen things going as they have gone, but I've remembered my duty as a wife, and I've held my tongue when any other woman in England would have spoken out. But there are some things which a woman can't stand and shouldn't, and if I'm to see my girls ruined and left without a roof over their heads, or a bit to eat, or a thing to wear, it shan't be for want of a word from me." "Didn't they always have plenty to eat?" "But where is it to come from if you're going to rush open-mouthed into the lion's jaws in this way. I've done my duty by you, T., and no man nor yet no woman can say anything to the contrary. And if it was myself only, I'd see myself on the brink of starvation before I'd say a word. But I can't see those poor girls brought to beggary without telling you what everybody in Baselhurst is talking about. And I can't see you, T., behaving in such a way and sit by and hold my tongue." "Behave in what way? Haven't I worked like a horse? Do you mean to tell me that I am to give up my business and my position and everything I have in the world, and go away because a young scoundrel comes to Baselhurst and tells me that he wants to have my brewery? I tell you what, Margaret, if you think I'm that sort of man, you don't know me yet." "I don't know about knowing you, T. No, you don't know me. If you come to that, I know very well that I have been deceived. I didn't want to speak of it, but now I must. I have been made to believe for these last 20 years that the brewery was all your own, whereas it now turns out that you've only got a share in it, and for aught I can see by no means the best share. Why wasn't I told all that before?" "Woman!" shouted Mr. Tappit. "Yes, woman indeed. I suppose I am a woman, and therefore I'm to have no voice in anything. Will you answer me one question, if you please? Are you going to that man Sharpit?" "Yes, I am." "Then, Mr. Tappit, I shall consult my brothers." Mr. Tappit's brothers were grocers in Plymouth, men whom Mr. Tappit had never loved. "They mayn't hold their heads quite as high as you do, or rather as you used to do when people thought that the establishment was all your own, but such as it is, nobody can turn them out of their shop in the market-place. If you are going to Sharpit, I shall consult them." "You may consult the devil if you like it." Oh, very well, Mr. Tappit. It's clear enough that you are not yourself any longer, and that somebody must take up your affairs and manage them for you. If you'll follow my advice, you'll stay at home this evening, and take a dose of physic and see Dr. Haustus quietly in the morning." "I shall do nothing of the kind." "Very well. Of course I can't make you. As yet you're your own master. If you choose to go to this silly meeting, and then to drink gin and water, and to smoke bad tobacco till all hours at the Dragon, and you in the dangerous state you are at present, I can't help it. I don't suppose that anything I could do now, that is quite immediately, would enable me to put you under fitting restraint." "Put me where?" Then Mr. Tappit looked at his wife with a look that was intended to annihilate her for the time being, seeing that no words that he could speak had any such effect, and he hurried out of the room without staying to wash his hands or brush his hair before he went off to preside at the meeting. Mrs. Tappit remained where she was for about half an hour, and then descended among her daughters. "Isn't papa going to dine at home?" said Augusta. "No, my dear. Your papa is going to dine with some friends of Mr. Hart's, the candidate who was beaten." "And has he settled anything about the brewery?" Cherry asked. "No, not as yet. Your papa is very much troubled about it, and I fear he is not very well. I suppose he must go to this electioneering dinner. When gentlemen take up that sort of thing, they must go on with it. And as they wish your father to preside over the petition, I suppose he can't very well help himself." "Is papa going to preside over the petition?" said Augusta. "Yes, my dear." "I hope it won't cost him anything," said Martha. "People say that those petitions do cost a great deal of money." "It's a very anxious time for me, girls. Of course you must all of you see that. I'm sure when we had our party I didn't think things were going to be as anxious as this, or I wouldn't have had a penny spent in such a way as that. If your papa could bring himself to give up the brewery, everything would be well." "I do so wish he would," said Cherry, "and let us all go and live at Torquay. I do so hate this nasty, dirty old place." "I shall never live in a house I like so well," said Martha. "The house is well enough, my dears, and so is the brewery. But it can't be expected that your father should go on working for ever as he does at present. It's too much for his strength, a great deal too much. I can see it, though I don't suppose anyone else can. No one knows, only me, what your father has gone through in that brewery." "But why doesn't he take Mr. Rowan's offer?" said Cherry. "Everybody seems to say now that Rowan is ever so rich," said Augusta. "I suppose papa doesn't like the feeling of being turned out," said Martha. "He wouldn't be turned out, my dear, not the least in the world," said Mrs. Tappit. "I don't choose to interfere much myself, because, perhaps, I don't understand it. But certainly I should like your papa to retire. I have told him so, but gentlemen sometimes don't like to be told of things." Mrs. Tappit could be very severe to her husband, could say to him terrible words if her spirit were put up, as she herself was wont to say. But she understood that it did not become her to speak ill of their father before her girls. Nor would she willingly have been heard by the servants to scold their master. And though she said terrible things, she said them with a conviction that they would not have any terrible effect. Tappit would only take them for what they were worth, and would measure them by the standard which his old experience had taught him to adopt. When a man has been long consuming red pepper, it takes much red pepper to stimulate his palate. Had Mrs. Tappit merely advised her husband, in proper conjugal phraseology, to relinquish his trade and to retire to Torquay, her advice, she knew, would have had no weight. She was eager on the subject, feeling convinced that this plan of retirement was for the good of the family generally, and therefore she had advocated it with energy. There may be those who think that a wife goes too far in threatening a husband with a commission of lunacy, and frightening him with the prospect of various fatal diseases. But the dose must be adapted to the constitution, and the palate that is accustomed to large quantities of red pepper must have quantities larger than usual whenever some special culinary effect is to be achieved. On the present occasion Mrs. Tappit went on talking to the girls of their father in language that was quite eulogistic. No threat against the absent brewer passed her mouth, or theirs. But they all understood each other, and were agreed that everything was to be done to induce papa to accept Mr. Rowan's offer. "Then," said Cherry, "he'll marry Rachel Ray, and she'll be mistress of the brewery house." "Never," said Mrs. Tappit, very solemnly. "Never. He'll never be such a fool as that." "Never," said Augusta. "Never." In the meantime the meeting went on at the Dragon. I can't say that Mr. Tappit was on this occasion called upon to preside over the petition. He was simply invited to take the chair at a meeting of a dozen men at Baselhurst, who were brought together by Mr. Sharpit in order that they might be induced by him to recommend Mr. Hart to employ him, Mr. Sharpit, in getting up the petition in question, and in order that there might be some sufficient temptation to these 12 men to gather themselves together, the dinner at the Dragon was added to the meeting. Mr. Tappit took the chair in the big, uncarpeted, fusty room upstairs, in which Masonic meetings were held once a month, and in which the farmers of the neighbourhood dined once a week on market days. He took the chair, and some 7 or 8 of his townsmen clustered round him. The others had sent word that they would manage to come in time for the dinner. Mr. Sharpit, before he put the brewer in his place of authority, prompted him as to what he was to do, and in the course of a quarter of an hour 2 resolutions, already prepared by Mr. Sharpit, had been passed unanimously. Mr. Hart was to be told by the assembled people of Baselhurst that he would certainly be seated by a scrutiny, and he was to be advised to commence his proceedings at once. These resolutions were duly committed to paper by one of Mr. Sharpit's clerks, and Mr. Tappit, before he sat down to dinner, signed a letter to Mr. Hart on behalf of the electors of Baselhurst. When the work of the meeting was completed, it still wanted half an hour to dinner, during which the 9 electors of Baselhurst sauntered about the yard of the inn, looked into the stables, talked to the landlady at the bar, indulged themselves with gin and bitters, and found the time very heavy on their hands. They were 9 decent-looking, middle-aged men, dressed in black, not of the newest, in swallow-tailed coats and black trousers, with chimney-pot hats and red faces. And as they pottered about the premises of the Dragon, they seemed to be very little at their ease. "What's up, Jim?" said one of the post-boys to the ostler. "Sharpit's got 'em all here to get some more money out of that 'ere Jew gent. That's about the ticket," said the ostler. "He's a clever un," said the post-boy. At last the dinner was ready, and the total number of the party having now completed itself, the Liberal electors of Baselhurst prepared to enjoy themselves. No bargain had been made on the subject, but it was understood by them all that they would not be asked to pay for their dinner. Sharpit would see to that. He would probably know how to put it into his little bill, and if he failed in that, the risk was his own. But while the body of the Liberal electors was peeping into the stables and drinking gin and bitters, Mr. Sharpit and Mr. Tappit were engaged in a private conference. "If you come to me," said Sharpit, "of course I must take it up. The etiquette of the profession don't allow me to decline." "But why should you wish to decline?" said Tappit, not altogether pleased by Mr. Sharpit's manner. "Oh, by no means, no. It's just the sort of work I like. Not much to be made by it, but there's injury to be redressed and justice to be done. Only, you see, poor Honeyman hasn't got much of a practice left to him, and I don't want to take his bread out of his mouth." "But I'm not to be ruined because of that. As I said before, if you bring the business to me, I must take it up. I can't help myself if I would. And if I do take it up, I'll see you through it. Everybody who knows me knows that of me." "I suppose I shall find you at home about 10 to-morrow?" "Yes, I'll be in my office at 10. Only you should think it well over, you know, Mr. Tappit. I've nothing to say against Mr. Honeyman, not a word. You'll remember that, if you please, if there should be anything about it afterwards. Ah, you are wanted for the chair, Mr. Tappit. I'll come and sit alongside of you, if you'll allow me." The dinner itself was decidedly bad, and the company undoubtedly dull. I am inclined to think that every individual there would have dined more comfortably at home. A horrid mess concocted of old gravy, catsup, and bad wine was distributed under the name of soup. Then there came upon the table half a huge hake, the very worst fish that swims, a fish with which Devonshire is peculiarly invested. Some hard, dark brown, mysterious balls were handed round, which on being opened with a knife were found to contain sausage meat, very greasy and by no means cooked through. Even the dura ilia of the liberal electors of Baselhurst declined to make acquaintance with these dainties. After that came the dinner, consisting of a piece of roast beef very raw, and a leg of parboiled mutton absolutely blue in its state of rawness. When the gory mess was seen which displayed itself on the first incision made into these lumps of meat, the Vice-President and one or two of his friends spoke out loud. That hard and greasy sausage meat might have been all right for anything they knew to the contrary, and the soup they had swallowed without complaint. But they did know what should be the state of a joint of meat when brought to the table, and therefore they spoke out in their anger. Tappit himself said nothing that was intended to be carried beyond the waiter, seeing that beer from his own brewery was consumed in the tap of the Dragon. But the Vice-President was a hardware dealer, with whom the Dragon had but small connection of trade, and he sent terrible messages down to the landlady, threatening her with the Blue Boar, the Mitre, and even with that nasty little pothouse, the Chequers. "What is it they expects for their 3 and 6pence?" said the landlady, in her wrath, for it must be understood that Sharpit knew well that he was dealing with one who understood the value of money, and that he did not feel quite sure of passing the dinner in Mr. Hart's bill. Then came a pie, with crust an inch thick, which nobody could eat, and a cabinet pudding, so called, full of lumps of suet. I venture to assert that each Liberal elector there would have got a better dinner at home, and would have been served with greater comfort. But a public dinner at an inn is the recognised relaxation of a middle-class Englishman in the provinces. Did he not attend such banquets, his neighbours would conceive him to be constrained by domestic tyranny. Others go to them, and therefore he goes also. He is bored frightfully by every speech to which he listens. He is driven to the lowest depths of dismay by every speech which he is called upon to make. He is thoroughly disgusted when he is called on to make no speech. He has no point of sympathy with the neighbours between whom he sits. The wine is bad. The hot water is brought to him cold. His seat is hard and crowded. No attempt is made at the pleasures of conversation. He is continually called upon to stand up that he may pretend to drink a toast in honour of some person or institution, for which he cares nothing, for the hero of the evening, as to whom he is probably indifferent, for the church, which perhaps he never enters, the army, which he regards as a hotbed of aristocratic insolence, or for the Queen, whom he reveres and loves by reason of his nature as an Englishman, but against whose fulsome praises, as repeated to him ad nauseam in the chairman's speech, his very soul unconsciously revolts. It is all a bore, trouble, ennui, nastiness, and discomfort, but yet he goes again and again, because it is the relaxation natural to an Englishman. The Frenchman who sits for 3 hours, tilted on the hind legs of a little chair, with his back against the window-sill of the café, with first a cup of coffee before him, and then a glass of sugar and water, is perhaps as much to be pitied as regards his immediate misery, but the liquids which he imbibes are not so injurious to him. Mr. Tappit, with the 11 other Liberal electors of Baselhurst, went through the ceremony of their dinner in the usual way. They drank the health of the Queen, and of the volunteers of the county, because there was present a podgy little grocer who had enrolled himself in the corps, and who was thus enabled to make a speech. And then they drank the health of Mr. Hart, whose ultimate return for the borough they pledged themselves to effect. Having done so much for business, and having thus brought to a conclusion the political work of the evening, they adjourned their meeting to a cosy little parlour near the bar, and then they began to be happy. Some few of the number, including the angry vice-president who sold hardware, took themselves home to their wives. "Mrs. Tongs keeps him sharp enough by the ears," said Sharpit, winking to Tappit. "Come along, old fellow, and we'll get a drop of something really hot." Tappit winked back again, and shook his head with an affected laugh. But as he did so, he thought of Mrs. T. at home, and the terrible words she had spoken to him, and at the same moment an idea came across him that Mr. Sharpit was a very dangerous companion. About half a dozen entered the cosy little parlour, and there they remained for a couple of hours. While sitting in that cosy little parlour, they really did enjoy themselves. About 9 o'clock they had a bit of the raw beef broiled, and in that guise it was pleasant enough, and the water was hot, and the tobacco was grateful, and the stiffness of the evening was gone. The men chatted together and made no more speeches, and they talked of matters which bore a true interest to them. Sharpit explained to them how each man might be assisted in his own business if this rich London tailor could be brought in for the borough, and by degrees they came round to the affairs of the brewery, and Tappit, as the brandy warmed him, spoke loudly against Rowan. "By George," said the podgy grocer, "if anybody would offer me 1,000 a year to give up, I'd take it hopping." "Then I wouldn't," said Tappit, "and what's more, I won't. But brewing ain't like other businesses. There's more in it than in most others." "Of course there is," said Sharpit. "It isn't like any common trade." "That's true too," said the podgy grocer. A man usually receives some compensation for having gone through the penance of the chairman's duties. For the remainder of the evening he is entitled to the flattery of his companions, and generally receives it till they become tipsy and insubordinate. Tappit had not the character of an intemperate man, but on this occasion he did exceed the bounds of a becoming moderation. The room was hot, and the tobacco smoke was thick. The wine had been bad, and the brandy was strong. Sharpit, too, urged him to new mixtures and stronger denunciations against Rowan, till at last, at 11 o'clock, when he took himself to the brewery, he was not in a condition proper for the father of such daughters, or for the husband of such a wife. "Shall I see him home?" said the podgy grocer to Mr. Sharpit. Tappit, with the suspicious quickness of a drunken man, turned sharply upon the podgy and abashed grocer, and abused him for his insolence. He then made his way out of the inn-yard, and along the High Street, and down Brewery Lane to his own door, knowing the way as well as though he had been sober, and passing over it as quickly. Nor did he fall or even stumble, though now and again he reeled slightly. And as he went, the idea came strongly upon him that Sharpit was a dangerous man, and that perhaps at this very moment he, Tappit, was standing on the brink of a precipice. Then he remembered that his wife would surely be watching for him, and as he made his first attempt to insert the latchkey into the door, his heart became forgetful of the brandy, and sank low within his breast. How affairs went between him and Mrs. Tappit on that night I will not attempt to describe. That she used her power with generosity I do not doubt. That she used it with discretion I am quite convinced. On the following morning at 10 o'clock, Tappit was still in bed. But a note had been written by Mrs. T. to Messrs. Sharpit and Longfight, saying that the projected visit had, under altered circumstances, become unnecessary. That Tappit's head was racked with pain, and his stomach disturbed with sickness, there can be no doubt, and as little that Mrs. T. used the consequent weakness of her husband for purposes of feminine dominion. But this she did with discretion and even with kindness. Only a word or two was said as to the state in which he had returned home, a word or two with the simple object of putting that dominion on a firm basis. After that, Mrs. Tappit took his condition as an established fact, administered to him the comforts of her medicine chest and teapot, excused his illness to the girls as having been produced by the fish, and never left his bedside till she had achieved her purpose. If ever a man got tipsy to his own advantage, Mr. Tappit did so on that occasion. And if ever a man in that condition was treated with forbearing kindness by his wife, Mr. Tappit was so treated then. "Don't disturb yourself, T," she said. "There's nothing wants doing in the brewery, and if it did, what would it signify in comparison with your health? The brewery won't be much to you now, thank goodness, and I'm sure you've had enough of it. 30 years of such work as that would make any man sick and weak. I'm sure I don't wonder at your being ill, not the least. The wonder is that you've ever stood up against it so long as you have. If you'll take my advice, you'll just turn round and try and sleep for an hour or so." Tappit took her advice, at any rate so far that he turned round and closed his eyes. Up to this time he had not given way about the brewery. He had uttered no word of assent, but he was gradually becoming aware that he would have to yield before he would be allowed to put on his clothes. And now, in the base and weak condition of his head and stomach, yielding did not seem to him to be so very bad a thing. After all, the brewery was troublesome, the fight was harassing. Rowan was young and strong, and Mr. Sharpit was very dangerous. Rowan, too, had risen in his estimation as in that of others, and he could no longer argue, even to himself, that the stipulated income would not be paid. He did not sleep, but got into that half-drowsy state in which men think of their existing affairs, but without any power of active thought. He knew that he ought to be in his counting-house and at work. He half feared that the world was falling away from him because he was not there. He was ashamed of himself, and sometimes almost entertained a thought of rising up and shaking off his lethargy. But his stomach was bad, and he could not bring himself to move. His head was tormented, and his pillow was soft, and therefore there he lay. He wondered what was the time of day, but did not think of looking at his watch, which was under his head. He heard his wife's steps about the room as she shaded some window from his eyes, or crept to the door to give some household order to one of her girls outside. But he did not speak to her, nor she to him. She did not speak to him as long as he lay there motionless, and when he moved with a small low groan, she merely offered him some beef tea. It was nearly 6 o'clock, and the hour of dinner at the brewery was long past, when Mrs. Tappit sat herself down by the bedside, determined to reap the fruit of her victory. He had just raised himself in his bed and announced his intention of getting up, declaring as he did so that he would never again eat any of that accursed fish. The moment of his renovation had come upon him, and Mrs. Tappit perceived that if he escaped from her now, there might even yet be more trouble. "It wasn't only the fish, T," she said, with somewhat of sternness in her eye. "I hardly drank anything," said Tappit. "Of course I wasn't there to see what you took," she said, "but you were very bad when you came home last night, very bad indeed. You couldn't have got in at the door only for me." "That's nonsense." "But it is quite true. It's a mercy, T, that neither of the girls saw you. Only think! But there'll be nothing more of that kind, I'm sure, when we are out of this horrid place. And it wouldn't have happened now, only for all this trouble." To this Tappit made no answer, but he grunted, and again said that he thought he would get up. "Of course it's settled now, T, that we're to leave this place." "I don't know that at all." "Then, T, you ought to know it. Come now, just look at the common sense of the thing. If we don't give up the brewery, what are we to do? There isn't a decent, respectable person in the town in favour of our staying here, only that rascal Sharpit. You desired me this morning to write and tell him you'd have nothing more to do with him, and so I did." Tappit had not seen his wife's letter to the lawyer, had not asked to see it, and now became aware that his only possible supporter might probably have been driven away from him. Sharpit, too, though dangerous as an enemy, was 10 times more dangerous as a friend. "Of course you'll take that young man's offer. Shall I sit down and write a line to Honeyman, and tell him to come in the morning?" Tappit groaned again and again, said that he would get up, but Mrs. T would not let him out of bed till he had assented to her proposition that Honeyman should be again invited to the brewery. He knew well that the battle was gone from him, had in truth known it through all those half-comatose hours of his bedridden day. But a man or a nation, when yielding, must still resist even in yielding. Tappit fumed and fussed under the clothes, protesting that his sending for Honeyman would be useless. But the letter was written in his name and sent with his knowledge, and it was perfectly understood that the invitation to Honeyman signified an unconditional surrender on the part of Mr. Tappit. One word Mrs. T said as she allowed her husband to escape from his prison amidst the blankets. One word by which to mark that the thing was done, and one word only. "I suppose we needn't leave the house for about a month or so, because it would be inconvenient about the furniture." "Who's to turn you out if you stay for 6 months?" said Tappit. The thing was marked enough then, and Mrs. Tappit retired in muffled triumph. Retired when she had made all things easy for the simplest ceremony of dressing. "Just sponge your face, my dear," she said, "and put on your dressing-gown, and come down for half an hour or so." "I'm all right now," said Tappit. "Oh, quite so, but I wouldn't go to the trouble of much dressing." Then she left him, descended the stairs, and entered the parlour among her daughters. When there, she could not abstain from one blast of the trumpet of triumph. "Well, girls," she said, "it's all settled, and we shall be in Torquay now before the winter." "No," said Augusta. "That'll be a great change," said Martha. "In Torquay before the winter," said Cherry. "Oh, mamma, how clever you have been!" "And now your papa is coming down, and you should thank him for what he's doing for you. It's all for your sake that he's doing it." Mr. Tappit crept into the room, and when he had taken his seat in his accustomed armchair, the girls went up to him and kissed him. Then they thanked him for his proposed kindness in taking them out of the brewery. "Oh, papa, it is so jolly," said Cherry. Mr. Tappit did not say much in answer to this. but luckily there was no necessity that he should say anything. It was an occasion on which silence was understood as giving a perfect consent. Section 28 of Rachel Ray. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Stevens. Rachel Ray by Anthony Trollope. Section 28. What took place at Bragg's End Farm. When Mrs. Tappit had settled within her own mind that the brewery should be abandoned to Rowan, she was by no means therefore ready to assent that Rachel Ray should become the mistress of the brewery house. Never, she had exclaimed when Cherry had suggested such a result. Never. And Augusta had echoed the protestation. Never, never. I will not say that she would have allowed her husband to remain in his business in order that she might thus exclude Rachel from such promotion, but she could not bring herself to believe that Luke Rowan would be so fatuous, so ignorant of his own interests, so deluded as to marry that girl from Bragg's End. It is thus that the Mrs. Tappits of the world regard other women's daughters when they have undergone any disappointment as to their own. She had no reason for wishing well to Rowan, and would not have cared if he had taken to his bosom a harpy in marriage. But she could not endure to hear of the success of the girl whose attractions had foiled her own little plan. "I don't believe that the man can ever be such a fool as that," she said again to Augusta, when on the evening of the day following Tappit's abdication a rumour reached the brewery that Luke Rowan had been seen walking out upon the Corston Road. Mr. Honeyman, in accordance with his instructions, called at the brewery on that morning, and was received by Mr. Tappit with a sullen and almost savage submission. Mrs. T. had endeavoured to catch him first, but in that she had failed. She did, however, manage to see the attorney as he came out from her husband. "It's all settled," said Honeyman, "and I'll see Rowan myself before half an hour is over." "I'm sure it's a great blessing, Mr. Honeyman," said the lady, not on that occasion assuming any of the glory to herself. "It was the only thing for him," said Mr. Honeyman. "That is, if he didn't like to take the young man in as acting partner." "That wouldn't have done at all," said Mrs. T. And then the lawyer went his way. In the meantime Tappit sat sullen and wretched in the counting-house. Such moments occur in the lives of most of us, moments in which the real work of life is brought to an end, and they cannot but be sad. It is very well to talk of ease and dignity, but ease of spirit comes from action only, and the world's dignity is given to those who do the world's work. Let no man put his neck from out of the collar, till in truth he can no longer draw the weight attached to it. Tappit had now got rid of his collar, and he sat very wretched in his brewery counting-house. "Be I to go, sir?" Tappit in his meditation was interrupted by these words, spoken not in a rough voice, and looking up he saw Worts standing in the counting-house before him. Worts had voted for Butler Cornbury, whereas, had he voted for Mr. Hart would have been returned. And upon that Worts, as a rebellious subject, had received notice to quit the premises. Now his time was out, and he came to ask whether he was to leave the scene of his 40 years of work. But what would be the use of sending Worts away, even if the wish to punish his contumacy still remained? In another week Worts would be brought back again in triumph, and would tread those brewery floors with the step almost of a master, while he, Tappit, could tread them only as a stranger, if he were allowed to tread them at all. "You can stay if you like," said Tappit, hardly looking up at the man. "I know you be a-going, Mr. Tappit," said the man, "and I hear you be a-going very handsome like. Gentlefolks such as you needn't go on working allers like us. If so be you be a-going, Mr. Tappit, I hope you and me'll part friendly. We've been together a sight of years, too great a sight for us to part unfriendly." Mr. Tappit admitted the argument, shook hands with the man, and then of course took him into his immediate confidence with more warmth than he would have done had there been no quarrel between them. And I think he found some comfort in this. He walked about the premises with Worts, telling him much that was true and some few things that were not strictly accurate. For instance, he said that he had made up his mind to leave the place, whereas that action of decisive resolution which we call making up our minds had perhaps been done by Mrs. Tappit rather than by him. But Worts took all these assertions with an air of absolute belief, which comforted the brewer. Worts was very wise in his discretion on that day, and threw much oil on the troubled waters, so that Tappit, when he left him, bade God bless him, and expressed a hope that the old place might still thrive for his sake. "And for your'n too, master," said Worts, "for you'll always have the best egg still. The young master, he'll only be a-working for you." There was comfort in this thought, and Tappit, when he went into his dinner, was able to carry himself like a man. The tidings which had reached Mrs. Tappit as to Rowan having been seen on that evening walking on the Cawston road with his face towards Bragg's End were true. On that morning Mr. Honeyman had come to him, and his career in life was at once settled for him. "Mr. Tappit is quite in time, Mr. Honeyman," he had said, "but he would not have been in time this day week unless he had consented to pay for what work had been already done, for I had determined to begin at once. The truth is, Mr. Rowan, you step into an uncommon good thing, but Mr. Tappit is tired of the work, and glad to give it up." Thus the matter was arranged between them, and before nightfall everybody in Baselhurst knew that Tappit and Rowan had come to terms, and that Tappit was to retire upon a pension. There was some little discrepancy as to the amount of Tappit's annuity, the Liberal faction asserting that he was to receive 2,000 a year, and those of the other side cutting him down to 200. On the evening of that day, in the cool of the evening, Luke Rowan sauntered down the High Street of Baselhurst and crossed over Cawston Bridge. On the bridge he was all alone, and he stood there for a moment or two, leaning upon the parapet, looking down upon the little stream beneath the arch. During the day many things had occupied him, and he had hardly as yet made up his mind definitely as to what he would do and what he would say during the hours of the evening. From the moment in which Honeyman had announced to him Tappit's intended resignation, he became aware that he certainly should go out to Bragg's End before that day was over. It had been with him a settled thing, a thing settled almost without thought ever since the receipt of Rachel's letter, that he would take this walk to Bragg's End when he should have put his affairs at Baselhurst on some stable footing, but that he would not take that walk before he had so done. "They say," Rachel had written in her letter, "they say that as the business here about the brewery is so very unsettled, they think it probable that you will not have to come back to Baselhurst any more." In that had been the offence. They had doubted his stability, and, beyond that, had almost doubted his honesty. He would punish them by taking them at their word till both should be put beyond all question. He knew well that the punishment would fall on Rachel, whereas none of the sin would have been Rachel's sin, but he would not allow himself to be deterred by that consideration. "It is her letter," he said to himself, "and in that way will I answer her. When I do go there again, they will all understand me better." It had been, too, a matter of pride to him that Mr. Comfort and Mrs. Butler Cornbury should thus be made to understand him. He would say nothing of himself and his own purposes to any of them. He would speak neither of his own means nor his own steadfastness. But he would prove to them that he was steadfast, and that he had boasted of nothing which he did not possess. when Mrs. Butler Cornbury had spoken to him down by the Cleeves, asking him of his purpose, and struggling to do a kind thing by Rachel, he had resolved at once that he would tell her nothing. She should find him out. He liked her for loving Rachel, but neither to her nor even to Rachel herself would he say more till he could show them that the business about the brewery was no longer unsettled. But up to this moment in which he was standing on the bridge, he had not determined what he would say to Rachel or to Rachel's mother. He had never relaxed in his purpose of making Rachel his wife since his first visit to the cottage. He was one who, having a fixed resolve, feels certain of their ultimate success in achieving it. He was now going to Bragg's End to claim that which he regarded as his own, but he had not as yet told himself in what terms he would put forward his claim. So he stood upon the bridge thinking. He stood upon the bridge thinking, but his thoughts would only go backwards, and would do nothing for him as to his future conduct. He remembered his first walk with her, and the churchyard elms with the setting sun, and the hot dances in Mrs. Tappit's house, and he remembered them without much of the triumph of a successful lover. It had been very sweet, but very easy. In so saying to himself, he by no means threw blame upon Rachel. Things were easy, he thought, and it was almost a pity that they should be so. As for Rachel, nothing could have been more honest or more to his taste than her mode of learning to love him. A girl who, while intending to accept him, could yet have feigned indifference, would have disgusted him at once. Nevertheless, he could not but wish that there had been some castles for him to storm in his career. Tappit had made but poor pretence of fighting before he surrendered, and as to Rachel, it had not been in Rachel's nature to make any pretence. He passed from the bridge at last without determining what he would say when he reached the cottage, but he did not pass on till he had been seen by the scrutinizing eyes of Miss Pucker. "If that ain't young Rowan going out to Bragg's End again," she said to herself, comforting herself, I fear, or striving to comfort herself, with an inward assertion that he was not going there for any good. Striving to comfort herself, but not effectually, for though the assertion was made by herself to herself, yet it was not believed. Though she declared, with well-pronounced mental words, that Luke Rowan was going on that path for no good purpose, she felt a wretched conviction at her heart's core that Rachel Ray would be made to triumph over her and her early suspicions by a happy marriage. Nevertheless, she carried the tidings up into Baselhurst, and as she repeated it to the grocer's daughters and the baker's wife, she shook her head with as much apparent satisfaction as though she really believed that Rachel oscillated between a ruined name and a broken heart. He walked on very slowly towards Bragg's End, as though he almost dreaded the interview, swinging his stick as was his custom, and keeping his feet on the grassy edges of the road till he came to the turn which brought him on to the green. When on the green he did not take the highway, but skirted along under Farmer Sturt's hedge, so that he had to pass by the entrance of the farmyard before he crossed over to the cottage. Here, just inside her own gate, he encountered Mrs. Sturt standing alone. She had been intent on the cares of her poultry-yard till she had espied Luke Rowan, but then she had forgotten chickens and ducks and all, and had given herself up to thoughts of Rachel's happiness in having her lover back again. "It's he as sure as eggs," she said to herself when she first saw him. "How mortal slow he do walk, to be sure. If he was coming as Joe to me, I'd soon shake him into quicker steps than them." "Oh, Mrs. Sturt," said he, "I hope you're quite well," and he stopped short at her gate. "Pretty bobbish, thank ye, Mr. Rowan. And how's yourself? Are you going over to the cottage this evening?" "Who's at home there, Mrs. Sturt?" "Well, they're all at home. Mrs. Ray and Rachel and Mrs. Prime. I don't know whether you know the eldest daughter, Mr. Rowan?" Luke did not know Mrs. Prime, and by no means wished to spend any of the hours of the present evening in making her acquaintance. "Is Mrs. Prime there?" he asked. "'Deed she is, Mr. Rowan. She's come back these last 2 days." Thereupon Rowan paused for a moment, having carefully placed himself inside the gatepost of the farmyard, so that he might not be seen by the inmates of the cottage, if haply he had hitherto escaped their eyes. "Mrs. Sturt," said he, "I wonder whether you'd do me a great favour." "That depends," said Mrs. Sturt. "If it's to do any good to any of them over there, I will. If I wanted to do harm to any of them, I shouldn't come to you." "Well, I should hope not. Is she and you going to be one, Mr. Rowan? That's about the whole of it." "It shan't be my fault if we're not," said Rowan. "That's spoken honest," said the lady, "and now I'll do anything in my power to bring you together. If you'll just go into my little parlour, I'll bring her to you in 5 seconds. I will indeed, Mr. Rowan. You won't mind going through the kitchen for once, will you?" Luke did not mind going through the kitchen, and immediately found himself shut up in Mrs. Sturt's back parlour, looking out among the mingled roses and cabbages. Mrs. Sturt walked quickly across the road to the cottage door, and went at once to the open window of the sitting-room. Mrs. Ray was there with a book in her hand, a serious book, the perusal of which I fear was in some degree due to the presence of her elder daughter. And Mrs. Prime was there with another book, evidently very serious. And Rachel was there too, seated on the sofa, deeply buried in the manipulation of a dress belonging to her mother. Mrs. Sturt was sure at once that they had not seen Luke Rowan as he passed inside the farmyard gate, and that they did not suspect that he was near them. "Oh, Mrs. Sturt, is that you?" said the widow, looking up. "You'll just come in for a minute, won't you?" And Mrs. Ray showed by a suppressed yawn that her attention had not been deeply fixed by that serious book. Rachel looked up, and bade the visitor welcome with a little nod. But it was not a cheery nod, as it would have been in old days, before her sorrow had come upon her. "I'll have the cherries back in her cheeks before the evening's over," said Mrs. Sturt to herself, as she looked at the pale-faced girl. Mrs. Prime also made some little salutation to their neighbour, but she did so with the very smallest expenditure of thoughts or moments. Mrs. Sturt was all very well, but Mrs. Prime had greater work on hand than gossiping with Mrs. Sturt. "I'll not just come in, thank ye, Mrs. Ray, but if it ain't troubling you, I want to speak a word to you outside, and a word to Rachel too, if she don't mind coming." "A word to me?" said Rachel, getting up and putting down her dress. Her thoughts nowadays were always fixed on the same subject, and it seemed that any special word to her must have reference to that. Mrs. Ray also got up, leaving her mark in her book. Mrs. Prime went on reading, harder than ever. There was to be some conference of importance from which she could not but feel herself to be excluded in a very special way. Something wicked was surely to be proposed, or she would have been allowed to hear it. She said nothing, but her head was almost shaken by the vehemence with which she read the book in her lap. Mrs. Sturt retired beyond the precincts of the widow's front garden before she said a word. Rachel had followed her first through the gate, and Mrs. Ray came after, with her apron turned over her head. "What is it, Mrs. Sturt?" said Rachel. "Have you heard anything?" "Heard anything? Well, I'm always a hearing of something. Do you slip across the green while I speak just one word to your mother. And Rachel, wait for me at the gate. Mrs. Ray, he's in my little parlour." "Who? Not Luke Rowan?" "But he is, though. That very young man. He's come over to make it up with her. He's told me so with his own mouth. You may be as sure of it as anything. You leave 'em to me, Mrs. Ray. I wouldn't bring them together if it wasn't for good. It's my belief our pet would have died if he hadn't come back to her. It is then." And Mrs. Sturt put her apron up to her eyes. Rachel, having paused for a moment as she looked first at her mother and then at Mrs. Sturt, had done as she was bidden, and had walked quickly across the green. Mrs. Ray, when she heard her neighbour's tidings, stood fixed by dismay and dread, mingled with joy. She had longed for his coming back, but now that he was there, close upon them, intending to do all that she had wished him to do, she was half afraid of him. After all, was he not a young man, and might he not even yet be a wolf? She was horror-stricken at the idea of sending Rachel over to see a lover, and looked back at the cottage window, towards Mrs. Prime, as though to see whether she was being watched in her iniquity. "Oh, Mrs. Sturt," she said, "why didn't you give us time to think about it?" "Give you time? How could I give you time, and he here on the spot? There's been too much time to my thinking. When young folk are agreeable, and the old folk are agreeable too, there can't be too little time. Come along over, and we'll talk of it in the kitchen while they talks in the parlour. He'd ha' been in there among you all only for Mrs. Prime. She is so dour-like for a young man to have to say anything before her, of the likes of that. That's why I took him into our place." They overtook Rachel at the house door, and they all went through together into the great kitchen. "Oh, Rachel," said Mrs. Ray, "oh dear!" "What is it, mamma?" said Rachel. Then, looking into her mother's face, she guessed the truth. "Mamma," she said, "he's here. Mr. Rowan is here." And she took hold of her mother's arm as though to support herself. "And that's just the truth," said Mrs. Sturt triumphantly. "He's through there in the little parlour, and you must just go to him, my dear, and hear what he's got to say to you." "Oh, mamma," said Rachel. "I suppose you must do what she tells you," said Mrs. Ray. "Of course she must," said Mrs. Sturt. "Mamma, you must go to him," said Rachel. "That won't do at all," said Mrs. Sturt. "And why has he come here?" said Rachel. "Ah, I wonder why," said Mrs. Sturt. "I wonder why any young man should come on such an errand. But it won't do to leave him standing there in my parlour by himself, so do you come along with me." So saying, Mrs. Sturt took Rachel by the arm to lead her away. Mrs. Ray, in this great emergency, was perfectly helpless. She could simply look at her daughter with imploring, loving eyes, and stand quivering in doubt against the dresser. Mrs. Sturt had very decided views on the matter. She had put Luke Rowan into the parlour with a promise that she would bring Rachel to him there, and she was not going to break her word through any mock delicacy. The two young people liked one another, and they should have this opportunity of saying so in each other's hearing. So she took Rachel by the arm, and opening the door of the parlour, led her into the room. "Mr. Rowan," she said, "when you and Miss Rachel have had your say out, you'll find me and her mamma in the kitchen." Then she closed the door and left them alone. Rachel, when first summoned out of the cottage, had felt at once that Mrs. Sturt's visit must have reference to Luke Rowan. Indeed, everything with her, in her present moods, had some reference to him, some reference though it might be ever so remote. But now, before she had time to form a thought, she was told that he was there in the same house with her, and that she was taken to him in order that she might hear his words and speak her own. It was very sudden, and for the space of a few moments she would have fled away from Mrs. Sturt's kitchen had such flight been possible. Since Rowan had gone from her, there had been times in which she would have fled to him, in which she would have journeyed alone any distance, so that she might tell him of her love, and ask whether she had got any right to hope for his. But all that seemed to be changed. Though her mother was there with her and her friend, she feared that this seeking of her lover was hardly maidenly. Should he not have come to her every foot of the way to her feet, and there have spoken, if he had aught to say, before she had been called on to make any sign? Would he like her for thus going to him? But then she had no chance of escape. She found herself in Mrs. Sturt's kitchen under her mother's sanction before she had been able to form any purpose. And then an idea did come to her, even at that moment, that poor Luke would have had a hard task of it in her sister's presence. When she was first told that he was there in the farmhouse parlour, her courage left her and she dreaded the encounter. But she was able to collect her thoughts as she passed out of the kitchen and across the passage, and when she followed Mrs. Sturt into the room, she had again acquired the power to carry herself as a woman, having a soul of her own. "Rachel," Rowan said, stepping up to her and tendering his hand to her, "I have come to answer your letter in person." "I knew," she said, "when I wrote it, that my letter did not deserve any answer. I did not expect an answer. But am I wrong now to bring you one in person? I have thought so much of seeing you again. Will you not say a word of welcome to me?" "I am glad to see you, Mr. Rowan." "Mr. Rowan? Nay, if it is to be Mr. Rowan, I may as well go back to Baselhurst. It has come to that it must be Luke now, or there must be no naming of names between us. You chided me once when I called you Rachel. You called me so once, sir, when I should have chided you, and did not. I remember it well. You were very wrong, and I was very foolish. But may I call you Rachel now?" Then, when she did not answer him at that moment, he asked the question again in that imperious way which was common with him. "May I not call you now as I please? If it be not so, my coming here is useless. Come, Rachel, say one word to me boldly. Do you love me well enough to be my wife?" She was standing at the open window, looking away from him, while he remained at a little distance from her, as though he would not come close to her till he had exacted from her some positive assurance of her love, as a penance for the fault committed by her letter. He certainly was not a soft lover, nor by any means inclined to abate his own privileges. He paused a moment, as though he thought that his last question must elicit a plain reply. But no reply to it came. She still looked away from him through the window, as though resolved that she would not speak till his mood should have become more tender. "You said something in your letter," he continued, "about my affairs here in Baselhurst being unsettled. I would not show myself here again till that matter was arranged." "It was not I," she said, turning sharply round upon him. "It was not I who thought that." "It was in your letter, Rachel." "Do you know so little of a girl like me as to suppose that what was written there came from me, myself? Did I not tell you that I said what I was told to say? Did I not explain to you that mamma had gone to Mr. Comfort? Did you not know that all that had come from him?" "I only know that I read it in your letter to me, the only letter you had ever written to me." "You are unfair to me, Mr. Rowan. You know that you are unfair." "Call me Luke," he said. "Call me by my own name." "Luke," she said, "you are unfair to me." "Then by heavens it shall be for the last time. May things in this world and the next go well with me, as I am fair to you for the future." So saying, he came up close to her, and took her at once in his arms. "Luke, Luke, don't! You frighten me, indeed you do. You shall give me a fair, open kiss, honestly, before I leave you. In truth you shall. If you love me, and wish to be my wife, and intend me to understand that you and I are now pledged to each other beyond the power of any person to separate us by his advice, or any mother by her fears, give me a bold, honest kiss, and I will understand that it means all that." Still she hesitated for a moment, turning her face away from him while he held her by the waist. She hesitated while she was weighing the meaning of his words, and taking them home to herself as her own. Then she turned her neck towards him, still holding back her head till her face was immediately under his own, and after another moment's pause she gave him her pledge as he had asked for it. Mrs. Sturt's words had come true, and the cherries had returned to her cheek. "My own Rachel, and now tell me one thing. Are you happy? So happy? My own one. But, Luke, I have been wretched, so wretched. I thought you would never come back to me." "And did that make you wretched?" "Ah, did it? What do you think yourself? When I wrote that letter to you, I knew I had no right to expect that you would think of me again. But how could I help thinking of you when I loved you? And then when mamma saw you in Exeter, and you sent me no word of message, I was determined to send none till this business was finished. Ah, that was cruel, but you did not understand. I suppose no man can understand. I couldn't have believed it myself till after you had gone away. It seemed as though all the sun had deserted us, and that everything was cold and dark." They stood at the open window looking out upon the roses and cabbages till the patience of Mrs. Sturt and of Mrs. Ray was exhausted. What they said, beyond so much of their words as I have repeated, need not be told. But when a low, half-abashed knock at the door interrupted them, Luke thought that they had hardly been there long enough to settle the preliminaries of the affair which had brought him to Bragg's End. "May we come in?" said Mrs. Sturt very timidly. "Oh, mamma!"
Section 29 of Rachel Ray. Read by Janet Carl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Rachel Ray by Anthony Trollope. Section 29. Mrs. Prime reads her recantation. Above an hour had passed after the interruption mentioned at the end of the last chapter, before Mrs. Ray and Rachel crossed back from the farmhouse to the cottage, and when they went alone. During that hour they had been sitting in Mrs. Sturt's parlour, and when at last they got up to go, they did not press Luke Rowan to go with them. Mrs. Prime was at the cottage, and it was necessary that everything should be explained to her before she was asked to give her hand to her future brother-in-law. The farmer had come in and had joked his joke, and Mrs. Sturt had clacked over them as though they were a brood of chickens of her own hatching, and Mrs. Ray had smiled and cried and sobbed and laughed till she had become almost hysterical. Then she had jumped up from her seat, saying, "Oh, dear, what will Dorothea think has become of us?" After that, Rachel insisted upon going, and the mother and daughter returned across the green, leaving Luke at the farmhouse ready to take his departure as soon as Mrs. Ray and Rachel should have safely reached their home. "I knew thee was minded steadfast to take her," said Mrs. Sturt, "when it came out upon the newspaper how thou had told them all in Baselhurst that thou would wedst none but a Baslehurst lass." In answer to this, Luke protested that he had not thought of Rachel when he was making that speech, and tried to explain that all that was soft sawder, as he called it, for the election. But the words were too apposite to the event, and the sentiment too much in accordance with Mrs. Sturt's chivalric views, to allow of her admitting the truth of any such assurance as this. "I know," she said, "I know. And when I read them words in the newspaper, I said to the good man there, 'We shall have bride cake from the cottage now before Christmas.'" "For the matter of that, so you shall," said Luke, shaking hands with her as he went, "or the fault will not be mine." Rachel, as she followed her mother out from the farmyard gate, had not a word to say. Could it have been possible she would have wished to remain silent for the remainder of the evening and for the night, so that she might have time to think of this thing which she had done and to enjoy the full measure of her happiness? Hitherto she had hardly any joy in her love. The cup had been hardly given to her to drink before it had been again snatched away, and since then she had been left to think that the draught for which she longed would never again be offered to her lips. The whole affair had now been managed so suddenly, and the action had been so quick, that she had hardly found a moment for thought. Could it be that things were so fixed that there was no room for further disappointment? She had been scalded so cruelly that she still feared the hot water. Her heart was sore with the old hurt, as the head that has ached will be still sore when the actual malady has passed away. She longed for hours of absolute quiet, in which she might make herself sure that her malady had also passed away, and that the soreness which remained came only from the memory of former pain. But there was no such perfect rest within her reach as yet. "Will you tell her, or shall I?" said Mrs. Ray, pausing for a moment at the cottage gate. "You had better tell her, Mamma." "I suppose she won't set herself against it, will she?" "I hope not, Mamma. I shall think her very ill-natured if she does. But it can't make any real difference now, you know." "No, it can't make any difference. Only it'll be so uncomfortable." Then, with half-frightened, muffled steps, they entered their own house and joined Mrs. Prime in the sitting-room. Mrs. Prime was still reading the serious book, but I am bound to say that her mind had not been wholly intent upon it during the long absence of her mother and sister. She had struggled for a time to ignore the slight fact that her companions were away gossiping with the neighboring farmer's wife. She had made a hard fight with her book, pinning her eyes down upon the page over and over again, as though in pinning down her eyes she could pin down her mind also. But, by degrees, the delay became so long that she was tantalized into surmises as to the subject of their conversation. If it were not wicked, why should not she have been allowed to share it? She did not imagine it to be wicked, according to the world's ordinary wickedness, but she feared that it was wicked according to that tone of morals to which she was desirous of tying her mother down as a bond slave. They were away talking about love and pleasure, and those heart-throbbings in which her sister had so unfortunately been allowed to indulge. She felt all but sure that some tidings of Luke Rowan had been brought in Mrs. Sturt's budget of news, and she had never been able to think well of Luke Rowan since the evening on which she had seen him standing with Rachel in the churchyard. She knew nothing against him, but she had then made up her mind that he was pernicious, and she could not bring herself to own that she had been wrong in that opinion. She had been loud and defiant in her denunciation when she had first suspected Rachel of having a lover. Since that, she had undergone some troubles of her own, by which the tone of her remonstrances had been necessarily moderated. But even now she could not forgive her sister such a lover as Luke Rowan. She would have been quite willing to see her sister married, but the lover should have been dingy, black-coated, lugubrious, having about him some true essence of the tears of the valley of tribulation. Alas, her sister's taste was quite of another kind. "I'm afraid you'll have been thinking that we were never coming back again," said Mrs. Ray as she entered the room. "No, Mother, I didn't think that. But I thought you were staying late with Mrs. Sturt." "So we were, and really I didn't think we had been so long. But, Dorothea, there was someone else over there besides Mrs. Sturt, and he kept us." "He? What he?" said Mrs. Prime. She had not even suspected that the lover had been over there in person. "Mr. Rowan, my dear. He had been at the farm." "What? The young man that was dismissed from Mr. Tappett's?" It was ill said of her, very ill said, and so she was herself aware as soon as the words were out of her mouth. But she could not help it. She had taken a side against Luke Rowan, and could not restrain herself from ill-natured words. Rachel was still standing in the middle of the room when she heard her lover thus described, but she would not condescend to plead in answer to such a charge. The color came to her cheeks, and she threw up her head with a gesture of angry pride, but at the moment she said nothing. Mrs. Ray spoke. "It seems to me, Dorothea," she said, "that you are mistaken there. I think he has dismissed Mr. Tappett." "I don't know much about it," said Mrs. Prime. "I only know that they've quarreled." "But it would be well that you should learn, because I'm sure you will be glad to think as well of your brother-in-law as possible." "Do you mean that he is engaged to marry Rachel?" "Yes, Dorothea. I think we may say that it is all settled now. Mayn't we, Rachel? And a very excellent young man he is. And as for being well off, a great deal better than what a child of mine could have expected. And a fine, comely fellow he is, as a woman's eye would wish to rest on." "Beauty is but skin deep," said Mrs. Prime, with no little indignation in her tone. that a thing so vile as personal comeliness should have been mentioned by her mother on such an occasion. "When he came out here and drank tea with us that evening," continued Mrs. Ray, "I took a liking to him most unaccountable, unless it was that I had a foreshadowing that he was going to be so near and dear to me." "Mother, there can have been nothing of the kind. You should not say such things. The Lord in his providence allows us no foreshadowing of any kind." "At any rate, I liked him very much, didn't I, Rachel? From the first moment I set eyes on him. Only I don't think he'll ever do away with cider in Devonshire because of the apple trees. But if people are to drink beer, it stands to reason that good beer will be better than bad." All this time Rachel had not spoken a word, nor had her sister uttered anything expressive of congratulation or good wishes. Now, as Mrs. Ray ceased, there came a silence in the room, and it was incumbent on the elder sister to break it. "If this matter is settled, Rachel—" "It is settled, I think," said Rachel. "If it is settled, I hope that it may be for your lasting happiness and eternal welfare." "I hope it will," said Rachel. "Marriage is an important step." "That's quite true, my dear," said Mrs. Ray. "A most important step, and one that requires the most exact circumspection, especially on the part of the young woman. I hope you may have known Mr. Rowan long enough to justify your confidence in him." It was still the voice of a raven. Mrs. Prime, as she spoke, thus knew that she was croaking, and would have divested herself of her croak and spoken joyously, had such mode of speech been possible to her. But it was not possible, though she would permit no such foreshadowings as those at which her mother had hinted. She had committed herself to forebodings against this young man to such extent that she could not wheel her thoughts round and suddenly think well of him. She could not do so as yet, but she would make the struggle. "God bless you, Rachel," she said when they parted for the night. "You have my best wishes for your happiness. I hope you do not doubt my love, because I think more of your welfare in another world than in this." Then she kissed her sister, and they parted for the night. Rachel now shared her mother's room, and from her mother, when they were alone, she received abundance of that sympathy for which her heart was craving. "You mustn't mind Dorothea," the widow said. "No, Mamma, I do not." "I mean that you mustn't mind her seeming to be so hard. She means well through it all, and is as affectionate as any other woman." Why did she say that he had been dismissed when she knew that wasn't true? "Ah, my dear, can't you understand? When she first heard of Mr. Rowan—" "Call him Luke, Mamma." "When she first heard of him, she was taught to believe that he was giddy, and that he didn't mean anything." "Why should she think evil of people? Who taught her?" "Miss Pucker and Mr. Prong and that set." "Yes, and they are the people who talk most of Christian charity." "But, my dear, they don't mean to be uncharitable. They try to do good. If Dorothea really thought that this young man was a dangerous acquaintance, what could she do but say so? And you can't expect her to turn around all in a minute. Think how she has been troubled herself about this affair of Mr. Prong's." "But that's no reason she should say Luke is dangerous." "Dangerous? What makes me so angry is that she should think everybody is a fool except herself. Why should anybody be more dangerous to me than to anybody else?" "Well, my dear, I think perhaps she is not so wrong there. Of course, everything is all right with you now, and I'm sure I'm the happiest woman in the world to feel that it is so. I don't know how to be thankful enough when I think how things have turned out. But when I first heard of him, I thought he was dangerous, too." "But you don't think he's dangerous now, Mamma?" "No, my dear, of course I don't. And I never did, after he drank tea here that night. Only Mr. Comfort told me it wouldn't be safe not to see how things went a little before you understand, dearest." "Yes, I understand. I ain't a bit obliged to Mr. Comfort, though I mean to forgive him because of Mrs. Cornbury. She has behaved best through it all, next to you, Mamma." I'm afraid it was late before Mrs. Ray went to sleep that night, and I almost doubt whether Rachel slept at all. It seemed to her that in the present condition of her life, sleep could hardly be necessary. During the month past she had envied those who slept while she was kept awake by her sorrow. She had often struggled to sleep as she sat in her chair, so that she might escape for a few moments from the torture of her waking thoughts. But why need she sleep now that every thought was a new pleasure? There was no moment that she had ever passed with him that had not to be recalled. There was no word of his that had not to be reweighed. She remembered, or fancied that she remembered, her idea of the man when her eye first fell upon his outside form. She would have sworn that her first glance of him had conveyed to her far more than had ever come to her from many a day's casual looking at any other man. She could almost believe that he had been specially made and destined for her behoof. She blushed even while lying in bed as she remembered how the gait of the man and the tone of his voice had taken possession of her eyes and ears from the first day on which she had met him. When she had gone to Mrs. Tappett's party, so consciously alive to the fact that he was to be there, she had told herself that she was sure she thought no more of him than any other man that she might meet. But she now declared to herself that she had been a weak fool in thus attempting to deceive herself, that she had loved him from the first, or at any rate from that evening when he had told her of the beauty of the clouds. And from that day to the present hour there had been no other chance of happiness to her but that chance which had now been so wondrously decided in her favor. When she came down to breakfast on the next morning, she was very quiet, so quiet that her sister almost thought she was frightened at her future prospects. But I think that there was no such fear. She was so happy that she could afford to be tranquil in her happiness. On that day, Rowan came to the cottage in the evening and was formally introduced to Mrs. Prime. Mrs. Ray, I fear, did not find the little tea party so agreeable on that evening as she had done on the previous occasion. Mrs. Prime did make some effort at conversation. She did endeavor to receive the young man as her future brother-in-law. She was gracious to him with such a graciousness as she possessed. But the duration of their meal was terribly long, and even Mrs. Ray herself felt relieved when the two lovers went forth for their evening walk. I think there must have been some triumph in Rachel's heart as she tied on her hat before she started. I think she must have remembered the evening on which her sister had been so urgent with her to go to the Dorcas meeting, when she had so obstinately refused that invitation and had instead gone out to meet the Tappett girls and had met with them the young man of whom her sister had before been speaking with so much horror. Now he was there on purpose to take her with him, and she went forth with him, leaning lovingly on his arm, while yet close under her sister's eyes. I think there must have been a gleam of triumph in her face as she put her hand with such confidence well round her lover's arm. Girls do triumph in their lovers, in their acknowledged and permitted lovers, as young men triumph in their loves which are not acknowledged or perhaps permitted. A man's triumph is for the most part over when he is once allowed to take his place at the family table as a right next to his betrothed. He begins to feel himself a sacrificial victim, done up very prettily with blue and white ribbons round his horns, but still an ox prepared for sacrifice. But the girl feels herself to be exalted for those few weeks as a conqueror, and to be carried along in an ovation of which that bucolic victim, tied round with blue ribbons onto his horns, is the chief grace and ornament. In this mood, no doubt, both Rachel and Luke Rowan went forth, leaving the two widows together in the cottage. "It is pretty to see her so happy, isn't it now?" said Mrs. Ray. The question for the moment made Mrs. Prime uncomfortable and almost wretched, but it gave her the opportunity which in her heart she desired, of recanting her error in regard to Luke Rowan's character. She wished to give in her adhesion to the marriage, to be known to have acknowledged its fitness, so that she could, with some true word of sisterly love, wish her sister well. In Rachel's presence she could not have first made this recantation, Though Rachel spoke no triumph, there was a triumph in her eye which prevented almost the possibility of such yielding on the part of Dorothea. But when the thing should have been once done, when she should once have owned that Rachel was not wrong, then gradually she could bring herself round to the utterance of some kindly expression. "Pretty," she said. "Yes, it is pretty. I do not know that anybody ever doubted its prettiness. And isn't it nice, too? Dear girl, it makes me so happy to see her light-hearted again. She has had a sad time of it, Dorothea, since we made her write that letter to him. A very sad time of it." "People here, Mother, do mostly have what you would call a sad time of it. Are we not taught that it is better for us that it should be so? Have not you and I, Mother, had a sad time of it? It would be all sad enough if this were to be the end of it." "Yes, just so. Of course we know that. But it can't be wrong that she should be happy now when things are all so bright for her. You wouldn't have thought it better for her, or for him either, that they should be kept apart, seeing that they really love each other." "No, I don't say that. If they love one another, of course it is right that they should marry. I only wish we had known him longer." "I'm not sure that these things always go much better because young people have known each other all their lives. It seems to be certain that he is an industrious, steady young man. Everybody seems to speak well of him now." "Well, Mother, I have nothing to say against him, not a word. And if it will give Rachel any pleasure, though I don't suppose it will, the least in the world, but if it would, she may know that I think she has done wisely to accept him." "Indeed it will, the greatest pleasure." "And I hope they will be happy together for very many years. I love Rachel dearly, though I fear she does not think so. And anything I have said in love, not in anger." "I am sure of that, Dorothea." "Now that she is to be settled in life as a married woman, of course she must not look to counsel either to you or to me. She must obey him, and I hope that God may give him grace to direct her steps aright." "Amen," said Mrs. Ray solemnly. It was thus that Mrs. Prime read her recantation, which was repeated on that evening to Rachel with some little softening touches. "You won't be living together in the same house after a bit," said Mrs. Ray, thinking, with some sadness, that those little evening festivities of buttered toast and thick cream were over for her now. "But I do hope you will be friends." "Of course we will, Mamma. She has only to put out her hand the least little bit in the world, and I will go the rest of the way. As for her living, I don't know what will be best about that, because Luke says that, of course, you'll come and live with us." It was 2 or 3 days after this that Rachel saw the Tappet girls for the first time since the fact of her engagement had become known. It was in the evening, and she had been again walking with Luke when she met them, but at that moment she was alone. Augusta would have turned boldly away, though they had all come closely together before either had been aware of the presence of the other. But to this both Martha and Cherry objected. "We have heard of your engagement," said Martha, "and we congratulate you. You have heard, of course, that we are going to move to Torquay, and we hope that you will be comfortable at the brewery." "Yes," said Augusta. "The place isn't what it used to be, and so we think it is best to go. Mamma has already looked at a villa near Torquay, which will suit us delightfully." Then they passed on, but Cherry remained behind to say another word. "I am so happy," said Cherry, "that you and he have hit it off. He's a charming fellow, and I always said he was to fall in love with you. After the ball, of course, there wasn't a doubt about it. Mind you send this
Section 30 of Rachel Ray. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. Rachel Ray by Anthony Trollope. Section 30. Conclusion. Early in November Mr. Tappit officially announced his intention of abdicating, and the necessary forms and deeds and parchment obligations were drawn out, signed, and sealed for the giving up of the brewery to Luke Rowan. Mr. Honeyman's clerk revelled in thinly covered folio sheets to the great comfort and profit of his master, while Mr. Sharpit went about Baselhurst declaring that Tappit was an egregious ass, and hinting that Rowan was little better than a clever swindler. What he said, however, had but little effect on Baselhurst. It had become generally understood that Rowan would spend money in the town, employing labour and struggling to go ahead, and Baselhurst knew that such a man was desirable as a citizen. The parchments were prepared, and the signatures were written with the necessary amount of witnessing, and Tappit and Rowan once more met each other on friendly terms. Tappit had endeavoured to avoid this, pleading, both to Honeyman and to his wife, that his personal dislike to the young man was as great as ever, but they had not permitted him thus to indulge his wrath. Mr. Honeyman pointed out to Mrs. Tappit that such ill-humour might be very detrimental to their future interests, and Tappit had been made to give way. We may as well declare at once that the days of Tappit's domestic dominion were over, as is generally the case with a man who retires from work and allows himself to be placed, as a piece of venerable furniture, in the chimney corner. Hitherto he, and he only, had known what funds could be made available out of the brewery for household purposes, and Mrs. Tappit had been subject, at every turn of her life, to provoking intimations of reduced profits. But now there was the clear 1,000 a year, and she could demand her rights in accordance with that sum. Tappit, too, could never again stray away from home with mysterious hints that matters connected with malt and hops must be discussed at places in which beer was consumed. He had no longer left to him any excuse for deviating from the regular course of his life, even by a hair's breadth. And before 2 years were over, he had learned to regard it almost as a favour to be allowed to take a walk with one of his own girls. No man should abdicate, unless indeed he does so for his soul's advantage. As to happiness in this life, it is hardly compatible with that diminished respect which ever attends the relinquishing of labour. Otium cum dignitate is a dream. There is no such position, at any rate for the man who has once worked. He may have the ease, or he may have the dignity, but he can hardly combine the two. This truth the unfortunate Tappit learned before he had been 3 months settled in the Torquay villa. He was called upon to meet Rowan upon friendly terms, and he obeyed. The friendship was not very cordial, but such as it was, it served its purpose. The meeting took place in the dining-room of the brewery, and Mrs. Tappit was present on the occasion. The lady received her visitor with some little affectation of grandeur, while T, standing with his hands in his pockets on his own rug, looked like a whipped hound. The right hand he was soon forced to bring forth, as Rowan demanded that he might shake it. "I am very glad that this affair has been settled between us amicably," said Luke, while he still held the hand of the abdicating brewer. "Yes, well, I suppose it's for the best," said Tappit, bringing out his words uncomfortably and with hesitation. "Take care and mind what you're about, or I suppose I'd have to come back again." "There'll be no fear of that, I think," said Rowan. "I hope not," said Mrs. Tappit, with a tone that showed she was much better able to master the occasion than her husband's. "I hope not, but this is a great undertaking for so young a man, and I trust you feel your responsibility. It would be disagreeable to us, of course, to have to return to the brewery after having settled ourselves pleasantly at Torquay, but we shall have to do so if things go wrong with you." "Don't be frightened, Mrs. Tappit. You shall never have to come back here." "I hope not, but it is always well to be on one's guard. I am sure you must be aware that Mr. Tappit has behaved to you very generously, and if you have the high principle for which we are willing to give you credit, and to which you ought to possess for the management of such an undertaking as the brewery, you will be careful that me and my daughters shan't be put to inconvenience by any delay in paying up the income regularly." "Don't be afraid of that, Mrs. Tappit." "Into the bank on quarter day, if you please, Mr. Rowan. Short accounts make long friends. And as Mr. T won't want to be troubled with letters and such like, you can send me a line to Montpellier Villa, Torquay, just to say that it's done." "Oh, I'll see to that," said Tappit. "My dear, as Mr. Rowan is so young for the business, there'll be nothing like getting him to write a letter himself, saying that the money is paid. It'll keep him up to the mark, like, and I'm sure I shan't mind the trouble." "Don't you be alarmed about the money, Mrs. Tappit," said Rowan, laughing, "and in order that you may know how the old shop is going on, I'll always send you at Christmas 16 gallons of the best stuff we're brewing." "That will be a very proper little attention, Mr. Rowan, and we shall be happy to drink success to the establishment. Here's some cake and wine on the table, and perhaps you'll do us a favour to take a glass, so as to bury any past unkindness. Tea, my love, would you pour out the wine?" It was 12 o'clock in the day, and the port wine, which had been standing for the last week in its decanter, was sipped by Luke Rowan without any great relish. But it also served its purpose, and the burial service over past unkindness was performed with as much heartiness as the nature of the entertainment admitted. It was not as yet full 4 months since Rowan had filled Rachel's glass with champagne in that same room. Then he had made himself quite at home in the house as a member of Mr. Tappit's family, but now he was going to be at home there as master of the establishment. As he put down the glass, he could not help looking round the room and suggesting to himself the changes he would make. As seen at present, the parlour of the brewery was certainly a dull room. It was very long since the wainscoting had been painted, longer since the curtains or carpets had been renewed. It was dark and dingy, but then so were the Tappits themselves. Before Rachel should be brought there, he would make the place as bright as herself. They said to him no word about his marriage. As for Tappit, he said few words about anything, and Mrs. Tappit, with all her wish to be gracious, could not bring herself to mention Rachel Ray. Even between her and her daughters there was no longer any utterance of Rachel's name. She had once declared to Augusta, with irrepressible energy, that the man was a greater fool than she had ever believed possible. But after that it had been felt that the calamity would be best endured in silence. When that interview in the dining-room was over, Rowan saw no more of Mrs. Tappit. Business made it needful that he should be daily about the brewery, and there occasionally he met the poor departing man wandering among the vats and empty casks like a brewer's ghost. There was no word spoken between them as to business. The accounts, the keys, and implements were all handed over through words, and Rowan found himself in possession of the whole establishment with no more trouble than would have been necessary in setting himself up in a new lodging. That promise which he had half made of sending bride-cake to Mrs. Sturt before Christmas was not kept, but it was broken only by little. They were married early in January. In December Mrs. Rowan came back to Baselhurst, and became the guest of her son, who was then keeping a bachelor's house at the brewery. This lady's first visit to the cottage after her return was an affair of great moment to Rachel. Everything now had gone well with her, except that question of her mother-in-law. Her lover had come back to her, a better lover than ever. Her mother petted her to her heart's content, speaking of Luke as though she had never suspected him of lupine propensities. Mr. Comfort talked to her of her coming marriage as though she had acted with great sagacity through the whole affair, addressing her in a tone indicating much respect, and differing greatly from that in which he had been wont to catechize her when she was nothing more than Mrs. Ray's girl at Bragg's End. And even Dolly had sent in her adhesion with more or less cordiality. But still she had feared Mrs. Rowan's enmity, and when Luke told her that his mother was coming to Baselhurst for the Christmas, so that she might also be present at the marriage, Rachel felt there was still a cloud in her heavens. "I know your mother won't like me," she said to Luke. "She made up her mind not to like me when she was here before." Luke assured her that she did not understand his mother's character, asserting that his mother would certainly like any woman that he might choose for his wife, as soon as she should have been made to understand that his choice was irrevocable. But Rachel remembered too well the report as to that former visit to the cottage which Mrs. Rowan had made together with Mrs. Tappit, and when she heard that Luke's mother was again in the parlour, She went down from her bedroom with hesitating step and an uneasy heart. Mrs. Rowan was seated in the room with her mother and sister when she entered it, and therefore the first words of the interview had been already spoken. To Mrs. Ray the prospect of the visit had not been pleasant, for she also remembered how grand and distant the lady had been when she came to the cottage on that former occasion. But Rachel observed, as she entered the room, that her mother's face did not wear that look of dismay which was usual to her when she was in any presence that was disagreeable to her. "My dear child," said Mrs. Rowan, rising from her seat and opening her arms for an embrace. Rachel underwent the embrace and kissed the lady by whom she found herself to be thus enveloped. She kissed Mrs. Rowan, but she could not for the life of her think of any word to speak which would be fitting for the occasion. "My own dear child," said Mrs. Rowan again, "for you know that you are to be my child now as well as your own mamma's." "It is very kind of you to say so," said Mrs. Ray. "Very kind indeed," said Mrs. Prime, "and I'm sure that you will find Rachel dutiful as a daughter." Rachel herself did not feel disposed to give any positive assurance on that point. She intended to be dutiful to her husband, and was inclined to think that obedience in that direction was quite enough for a married woman. "Now that Luke is going to settle himself for life," continued Mrs. Rowan, "it is so very desirable that he should be married at once. Don't you think so, Mrs. Ray?" "Indeed, yes, Mrs. Rowan. I always like to hear of young men getting married. That is, when they've got anything to live upon. It makes them less harum-scarum-like." "I don't think Luke was ever what you call harum-scarum," said Mrs. Rowan. "Mother didn't mean to say he was," said Mrs. Prime, "but marriage certainly does steady a young man, and generally makes him much more constant at the divine service." "My Luke always did go to church very regularly," said Mrs. Rowan. "I like to see young men in church," said Mrs. Ray. "As for the girls, they go as a matter of course, but young men are allowed so much of their own way. When a man is a father of a family, it becomes very different." Hereupon Rachel blushed, and then was kissed again by Luke's mother, and was made the subject of certain very interesting prophecies, which embarrassed her considerably, and which need not be repeated here. After that interview she was never again afraid of her mother-in-law. "You'll love mamma when you know her," said Mary Rowan to Rachel a day or two afterwards. "Strangers and acquaintances generally think that she is a very tremendous personage, but she always does what she is asked by those who belong to her. And as for Luke, she's almost a slave to him." I won't say that Rachel resolved that Mrs. Rowan should be a slave to her also, but she did resolve that she would not be a slave to Mrs. Rowan. She intended henceforward to serve one person, and one person only. Mrs. Butler Cornbury also called at the cottage, and her visit was very delightful to Rachel, not the less so perhaps because Mrs. Prime was away at a Dorcas meeting. Had she been at the cottage, all those pleasant allusions to the transactions at the ball would hardly have been made. "Don't tell me," said Mrs. Cornbury. "Do you think I couldn't see how it was going to be with half an eye? I told Walter that very night that he was a goose to suppose that you should go down to supper with him." "But, Mrs. Cornbury, I really intended it, only they had another dance, and I was obliged to stand up with Mr. Rowan because I was engaged to him." "I don't doubt you were engaged to him, my dear. Only for that dance, I mean." "Oh, only for that dance, of course. But you are engaged to him for something else, and I tell you that I knew it was going to be so." All this was very pretty and very pleasant, and when Mrs. Cornbury, as she went away, made a special request that she might be invited to the wedding, Rachel was supremely happy. "Mamma," she said, "I do love that woman. I hardly know why, but I do love her so much." "It was always the same with Patty Comfort," said Mrs. Ray. "She had a way of making people fond of her. They say that she can do just what she likes with the old gentleman at the Grange." It may be well that I should declare here that there was no scrutiny as to the return of Butler Cornbury to Parliament, to the great satisfaction both of old Mr. Cornbury and of old Mr. Comfort. They had been brought to promise that the needful funds for supporting the scrutiny should be forthcoming, but the promise had been made with heavy hearts, and the tidings of Mr. Hart's quiescence had been received very gratefully, both at Cornbury and at Corston. Luke and Rachel were married on New Year's Day at Corston Church, and afterwards made a short marriage trip to Penzance and the Land's End. It was cold weather for pleasure travelling, but snow and winds and rain affect young married people less, I think, than they do other folk. Rachel, when she returned, could not bear to be told that it had been cold. There was no winter, she said, at Penzance, and so she continued to say ever afterwards. Mrs. Ray would not consent to abandon the cottage at Bragg's End. She still remained its occupier in conjunction with Mrs. Prime, but she passed more than half her time at the brewery. Mrs. Prime is still Mrs. Prime, and would, I think, remain so, although Mr. Prong is occasionally seen to call at the cottage. It is, I think, now universally admitted by all Devonshire and Cornwall that Lew Grone has succeeded in brewing good beer. With what results to himself I am not prepared to say. I do not, however, think it probable that he will succeed in his professed object of shutting up the apple orchards of the county.